Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleepless Dossier, the only place where history keeps you up at night. Today we're pulling the curtain back on one of the most enduring and deceptively simple mysteries in the historical record: the collapse of the classic Maya civilization. This wasn't just the end of an empire, it was a carefully constructed narrative of disappearance, a story sold to the world as a cautionary tale. It was a global game of academic chicken, played with real ruins and fake certainties, and the true history they don't want you to know is infinitely more complex and disturbing. This isn't a story with heroes. It's about the intellectual trenches where reputations are made and inconvenient truths are buried. Before we dive into the inevitable betrayals and buried evidence, if you appreciate us digging up the facts that keep historians awake, please hit that like and subscribe. It ensures these secrets keep finding their way into the light. All right, dim the lights. This one gets messy. The story they tell you is clean, elegant, and almost poetic. It goes like this. In the humid jungles of Mesoamerica, a brilliant civilization arose. The Maya, a people of profound intellect and artistic genius, charted the heavens with terrifying accuracy, developed a form of writing unparalleled in the ancient Americas, and built monumental cities of white limestone that gleamed like beacons against the green canopy. They were philosopher kings, priest astronomers, a people in tune with the cosmic rhythms. Then around the 9th century AD, the cosmic rhythm faltered. The rain stopped. The sky gods turned their backs, and a cataclysmic, century-long drought, a true mega-drought, scorched the earth. The crops failed, the rivers ran dry, and this magnificent civilization, helpless against the raw power of nature, simply withered away. The great cities were abandoned, swallowed by the jungle, leaving behind only silent stone witnesses to a people who vanished from the stage of history. It's a perfect tragedy. It has a noble protagonist, a powerful and impersonal antagonist in climate change, and a dramatic, haunting conclusion. It is a story that fits neatly into a 2-hour documentary or a 3-page chapter in a world history textbook. And that is precisely the problem. Because this endorsed narrative, this clean, simple story of a great civilization erased by a great drought, is the most dangerous kind of lie. The kind that feels true. The truth is never that simple, and power, whether in an ancient kingdom or a modern university department, abhors a vacuum. The vacuum in our understanding of the Maya collapse was filled, not by accident, but by design. A narrative was constructed brick by brick, publication by publication, that privileged one explanation above all others. Why? Because the alternative was unthinkable. The alternative involved looking at the evidence the Maya themselves left behind and admitting that their society was not a monolith of peaceful stargazers. The alternative meant acknowledging that the collapse was not a singular event, but a drawn-out, agonizing process of political disintegration, endemic warfare, and environmental self-destruction. The real story was bloody, chaotic, and intensely human. It was a story of dynastic ambition, of desperate kings making catastrophic decisions, of a system tearing itself apart from the inside out. The drought was real, yes, but to call it the cause is like calling the match the cause of the inferno when the house was already soaked in gasoline. The climate was the trigger, not the weapon. The weapon was the Maya political system itself. This oversimplification wasn't a benign mistake born of ignorance. It was, and remains, a form of intellectual gatekeeping. For decades, it was professionally safer to discuss rainfall metrics than to analyze the brutal political calculus carved into a stone lintel from Yaxchilan, depicting a king torturing a captive. It was easier to get funding to drill sediment cores from a lakebed than to propose that the collapse was a cascading failure of alliances, a geopolitical implosion mirroring the fall of Rome, but on a regional scale. The simplicity was comforting not just for the public but for the experts. It placed the Maya collapse in the category of natural disasters, alongside Pompeii or the Minoan civilization after Thera. It removed the burden of judgment. You cannot blame a people for a lack of rain, but you can and must analyze a political class that drives its society into a wall. The narrative of a climate apocalypse was, in essence, a pardon. Consider this: a sentiment expressed in a private letter by a leading mid-century Mesoamerican archaeologist. a man whose work would define the field for a generation. It's the kind of thing never said at a press conference, but it is the bedrock of the entire public-facing edifice of history. Uncomfortable. Quote, "We must present a coherent story. The public, and more importantly our patrons, cannot digest a dozen interconnected variables of systemic failure. They need a villain, a single identifiable force. Let that villain be the weather. It is a far more palatable explanation for the fall of a great people than political rot or the inherent savagery of their ritual warfare. We are memorializing them, not putting their descendants on trial." And there it is. The quiet, cynical calculus behind the curtain. Palatable explanation. Memorializing, not trying. It is a confession that the goal was not to find the most accurate truth, but the most acceptable one. The meta-commentary, the long-term devastating consequence of this decision, is that it infantilized an entire civilization. By stripping the classic Maya of their political agency, we turned them from actors into objects. They ceased to be a people who made choices, good and bad, and became a data point in a climate change graph. Their magnificent, terrifyingly complex society, with all its brilliance and all its flaws, was flattened into a morality tale for the modern world about environmentalism. The kings, the queens, the generals, the rebels, the collaborators, their stories, their lives, their desperate struggles for power and survival, were all washed away by the neat and tidy tide of the Great Drought theory. It was an intellectual cleansing, and it set the stage for a bitter decades-long fight for the soul of Maya history, a fight that would pit geologists against epigraphers' climate data, against the written word of the Maya themselves. The endorsed narrative was clean, but the evidence was about to get very, very dirty. That sanctioned narrative, the tidy story of a climate-induced collapse, feels modern, scientific, rooted in the hard data of isotope analysis and sediment cores. But its foundations were laid a century earlier, not in a laboratory, but in the mud and malaria of the Central American jungle, by men with quill pens and sketchbooks. The intellectual crime scene was established long before the forensic tools arrived. To understand the lie, you have to go back to the source, to the moment the West discovered the Maya, and in the very same breath, declared them dead. It begins with the cities of silent stone. In 1839, an American diplomat and writer named John Lloyd Stevens, accompanied by the brilliant English artist Frederick Catherwood, hacked their way into the rainforest of what is now Honduras. What they found at the site of Copan would electrify the Western world. Here were stelae covered in cryptic glyphs, pyramids choked by saber roots, and plazas so grand they defied the imagination. They had stumbled upon a world that, to them, had no right to exist. Their subsequent books, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, became international bestsellers, and it was Catherwood's illustrations that did the most damage. His drawings are magnificent, technically brilliant, and hauntingly evocative. They are also profoundly dishonest. He depicted the ruins of Copan, Palenque, and Uxmal as desolate, romantic landscapes. He captured the encroaching power of the jungle, the intricate decay of the stonework, the sheer, awesome scale of abandonment. But his images are almost entirely devoid of people. When they do appear, they are small, anonymous figures, serving only to give a sense of scale, like tourists in a museum of a dead world. This was a deliberate artistic and narrative choice. It sold the mystery. It created the central myth. A great civilization, a lost race, had built these wonders and then vanished from the face of the earth, leaving no trace but these majestic, silent ruins. This was the foundational deception upon which everything else is built. Because the Maya had not vanished. They were everywhere. Stevens and Catherwood hired local Maya guides to lead them to the ruins. They stayed in Maya villages. They ate Maya food. They saw firsthand the vibrant living culture that persisted in the shadow of the old cities, and yet they could not or would not make the connection. The cognitive dissonance was too great. The magnificent architects of the past could not possibly be related to the impoverished, subjugated indigenous people they encountered. This prejudice, this casual, systemic racism of the colonial era, is the key that unlocks the entire conspiracy of the collapse. It wasn't a conclusion reached from evidence. It was a precondition brought into the jungle with their luggage. The narrative of disappearance was a necessity, because the alternative, that the descendants of this grand civilization were the very people they were hiring for a few pesos a day, was an uncomfortable indictment of the colonial system itself. The intellectual gymnastics they performed to avoid this simple truth were extraordinary. Stevens himself initially entertained the popular theories of the day. These cities were the work of a lost tribe of Israel, or Egyptians who had crossed the Atlantic, or refugees from Atlantis. Anyone but the Maya, while he eventually, and to his credit, came to argue that the ruins were built by the ancestors of the local inhabitants, the damage was done. The initial shock of his discovery had cemented the idea of a lost civilization in the public mind, and this idea was predicated on a quiet, brutal assumption, articulated in the private journals and public writings of a dozen different explorers of that era. Uncomfortable. Quote, "One looks upon these sublime and silent ruins with a feeling of awe, convinced that they are not the work of the miserable, degraded race that now inhabits these forests. The architects of these palaces, the sculptors of these stones, were a people of a different order entirely. To believe otherwise is to stretch credulity to its breaking point. There you have it, the prime directive of the entire mystery-making enterprise. It is impossible that these people are related to those people. The conclusion is drawn before the investigation even begins. This single racist idea is the patient zero of the Maya collapse narrative. It is the original sin, and its long-term consequence, its meta-commentary on the writing of history, is that it created a phantom. By severing the connection between the past and the present, these early explorers created a historical ghost town and then asked, where did everybody go? They manufactured the mystery. They ignored the living Maya so they could romanticize the dead ones. This act of intellectual erasure defined the boundaries of the investigation for the next 150 years. It meant that the central question of Maya archaeology became, why did they collapse, instead of, how did their society transform, and how have they survived? The first question assumes an ending, a finality, a vanishing. The second assumes continuity and resilience. By choosing the former, the entire field of study was steered down a narrative cul-de-sac. The focus became the autopsy of a dead civilization, not the biography of a living one. They were looking for a single catastrophic cause of death because they had already signed the death certificate. The stage was now perfectly set. The public was primed with images of empty cities. The academic world had accepted the premise of a total, systemic collapse and disappearance. All that was needed now was a suitably epic culprit, a villain powerful enough to have slain this brilliant lost civilization. The search was on for a murder weapon, and in the 20th century, scientists believed they found it, buried in the mud at the bottom of a lake. The weapon was found in the Yucatan Peninsula, not in a king's tomb or a sacrificial well, but at the bottom of a nondescript body of water called Lake Chichancanab. The name, in Yucatec Mayan, means Little Sea. For centuries, this lake held a silent confession, a chemical record of atmospheric crimes layered meticulously in the ooze of its bed. In the 1990s, a team of paleoclimatologists, led by David Hodel, arrived with a mission. They were not treasure hunters or archaeologists. They were climate detectives. They dropped a weighted tube from a floating platform, driving it deep into the sediment, and pulled up a long, perfect cylinder of mud. This mud core was a time machine. Each millimeter of sediment represented a slice of history, a deposition of dust, pollen, and chemical signatures from the surrounding environment. And within this archive, they were looking for one thing: the fingerprint of a killer drought. The science is as elegant as it is damning. Lake Chichancanab is a closed basin, meaning water flows in but only escapes through evaporation. During wet years, the lake is full. During dry years, the water level drops, and the concentration of dissolved minerals increases. One of these minerals is gypsum. When the water becomes saturated enough, gypsum precipitates out, forming a distinct layer in the sediment. A thick band of gypsum, therefore, is a tombstone for a dry spell. When Hodel's team analyzed the core, they found exactly what they were looking for. In the layers dated between 800 and 1000 AD, the precise window of the Great Southern Lowland collapse, the gypsum levels spiked dramatically. It wasn't just a dry spell. The data pointed to the most intense, prolonged period of aridity in the previous 7,000 years. This was it. The murder weapon wasn't just found. It was glowing with radioactive certainty. The paper, published in Nature in 1995, was a bombshell. It was the hard data everyone had been waiting for. It was science, not speculation. And this is where the operation shifts from scientific discovery to narrative enforcement. The actual data in the Chichancanab core was complex. It showed multiple droughts, periods of recovery, a climate that was fluctuating, becoming more volatile. The study itself was a model of scientific caution, but that's not the story that was sold. The academic establishment, the university press offices, the documentary filmmakers, and the popular science writers, they all seized upon the most dramatic element. The nuances were sanded off, the complexities discarded. The testimony of the lakebed mud was ruthlessly simplified to a single terrifying headline: Megadrought killed the Maya. It became the centerpiece of the endorsed narrative, the unassailable fact that anchored the entire story. Any lingering doubts were now cast as unscientific, Luddite resistance to the pure objective truth of geochemistry. The lake had confessed. The case was closed. This process of deliberate simplification wasn't accidental. It was a strategic choice, a calculated move in the high-stakes game of public understanding and institutional funding. A complex story of climate volatility doesn't make for a good press release. A story of a civilization slaying megadrought, however, is a blockbuster. It's a modern cautionary tale that writes itself. Classified Memo 2. University Communications and Media Relations. From Senior Provost External Affairs. Subject: Framing the Hodel et al. Chichancanab Findings. Date: March 12, 1995. Priority: High Team. The Nature paper is a major institutional win. We need to control the narrative from the outset. Public-facing language should be definitive. Downplay the climate variability in the preceding centuries. It muddies the water. The key takeaway is the dramatic gypsum spike correlating directly with the 9th century abandonment of southern sites. Our story is sudden catastrophic climate change wipes out ancient superpower. This framing has clear parallels to modern climate concerns and maximizes media pickup. We are telling a powerful, simple, cautionary tale, not publishing a dissertation for a handful of specialists. Keep it simple, keep it dramatic, and let's get it on the front page. The long-term consequence of this maneuver was the creation of a powerful academic dogma. The Chichancanab core became a shield for intellectual laziness. For more than a decade, the drought theory wasn't just a theory. It was the baseline truth. Evidence of endemic warfare? That was just a symptom of drought-induced stress. Evidence of political breakdown? A secondary effect of resource scarcity caused by the drought. All other lines of inquiry were now forced to pay tribute to the climate king. It stifled research, redirected funding, and created a hostile environment for scholars who saw a different, more complicated picture. The very science that should have opened up new avenues of investigation was instead used to shut them down. The star witness, the mud from the bottom of the lake, had been coached. Its testimony was tailored to fit a pre-written conviction, but there was another witness, one that had been silent for centuries, not because it couldn't speak, but because no one could understand its language. While the climate scientists were listening to the whispers from the lakebed, a small, dedicated cadre of codebreakers was beginning to hear shouts from the silent stones. While the climate proxies from the lakebed were being hailed as the final word, a quiet insurgency was fomenting in the hushed halls of libraries and archives. This was a different kind of intelligence operation, one that required not drilling rigs and mass spectrometers, but painstaking linguistic analysis and an almost fanatical devotion to pattern recognition. The targets were the glyphs, the intricate, beautiful, and utterly indecipherable script carved into the stone monuments of every Maya city. For decades, the official story about the writing was as clean and simplistic as the story of the collapse itself. The high priest of Maya studies for the mid-20th century, A towering and intimidatingly influential English archaeologist named Sir J. Eric S. Thompson had issued a verdict that was treated as gospel. The glyphs were not a true writing system. They did not record history, politics, or the names of kings. Instead, they were purely mystical and calendrical, a cryptic code used by priests to track the movements of the planets and the abstract passage of sacred time. The Maya, in Thompson's world, were peaceful, anonymous time worshippers, and the story on the stones was nothing more than a divine clock. This was the doctrine, the party line, and it was a convenient one. A civilization of faceless astronomer priests is much easier to cast as a helpless victim of a natural disaster. A civilization with named kings, warring dynasties, and political propaganda is a far messier proposition. The insurgency began not in the jungles of Mesoamerica, but in a bombed-out library in post-war Berlin. A young Russian soldier named Yuri Knorozov stumbled upon a rare book on the Maya codices. Working in isolation behind the Iron Curtain, and armed with the Marxist-Leninist belief that all societies must have a recorded history, he achieved the critical breakthrough that Thompson and the entire Western establishment had missed. The glyphs were not just pictograms or ideograms. They were a mixed system, and many of the symbols represented phonetic syllables. The Maya could spell out words. It was a true script. Knorozov's work, published in the 1950s, was arrogantly dismissed by Thompson, who used his immense influence to ridicule the upstart Soviet. The Cold War had found a new front in the arcane world of Mesoamerican epigraphy. The dam truly broke thanks to an outsider, an architect and artist named Tatiana Proskouriakov. She wasn't a trained epigrapher, so she wasn't burdened by Thompson's dogma. While studying the patterns of dates on the monuments at Piedras Negras, she noticed a recurring structure. A certain glyph, the upended frog glyph, always appeared with the earliest date in a series on a given monument, and another glyph, the toothache glyph, appeared with a later date, followed by the name of a new ruler. She hypothesized that she wasn't looking at astronomical events, but human lives. The first glyph marked a birth, the second an accession to the throne. She was right. In a single brilliant paper published in 1960, she proved that the stelae were historical documents, recording the biographies of kings and queens. The walls could talk, and the story they told was not one of peaceful meditation on the cosmos. As the code was cracked further by a new generation of epigraphers like Linda Skeely and David Stewart, a torrent of new intelligence poured forth. These weren't just the names of kings. These were records of war, detailed accounts of battles, captures, ritual torture, and sacrifice. The glyph for capture was everywhere. The title He of 20 Captives was a badge of supreme honor. Inscriptions at Tikal detailed its crushing victory over its rival, Calakmul. Stelae at Yaxchilan depicted kings in terrifying war regalia, holding the severed heads of their enemies. This was not the history of a peaceful people. This was the history of ancient Greece or Renaissance Italy, a network of ferociously competitive city-states led by divine kings who used warfare as a primary instrument of policy and a source of political legitimacy. The whispers from the walls were becoming a deafening roar of political violence. This new truth was a direct assault on the established narrative, and the old guard did not take it lying down. Uncomfortable. Quote, "This new school of thought is a projection of our own violent, cynical age onto a nobler past. To suggest that these magnificent stelae, erected by men who charted the course of Venus to the day, are nothing more than crude war monuments and royal propaganda is a profound insult to the Maya spirit. They were recording the sacred movements of the heavens, not the petty squabbles of territorial chieftains. The obsession with finding history and politics in the stones is a scholarly fad, and it will pass. But it didn't pass. The meta-commentary, the earth-shattering consequence of this decipherment, was that the Maya were given their voice back. They were no longer the silent, passive victims of the story we wrote for them. They were now the authors of their own history, and their history was one of ambition, alliance, betrayal, and bloodshed. The so-called collapse could no longer be viewed as a simple act of God or a failure of the sky. It now had to be viewed through a political lens. Did the droughts cause stress? Undoubtedly. But the deciphered text revealed a political system built on perpetual, ritualized conflict. Such a system is inherently brittle. It thrives in times of plenty, but shatters in times of scarcity. The cracking of the code revealed that the house of the classic Maya was a tinderbox of political rivalries long before the climate began to send sparks. The next phase of the investigation would use this new intelligence to look at specific cases, to see not just that the Maya went to war, but how their wars led them directly to ruin. To see how this new intelligence from the stones completely dismantled the official narrative, you don't need a map of the entire Maya world. You just need the file on a single doomed city-state. The site is called Dos Pilas, located in the Pitexbatun region of Guatemala. Think of this region not as some peaceful backwater, but as a geopolitical flashpoint, a Cold War Berlin nestled in the jungle, caught between the gravitational pull of two opposing superpowers, the ancient venerable dynasty of Tikal and its mortal enemy, the expansionist Serpent Kingdom, based at Calakmul. The story of Dos Pilas, written with agonizing clarity on its own monuments, is not a story of climate collapse. It is a dossier on state-sponsored betrayal, proxy warfare, and the catastrophic domino effect of a single political decision. It is the case study that proves the Maya didn't just wither, they tore themselves to pieces. The operation began around 629 AD. A prince from the royal house of Tikal, a man named Balaj Chan Kawil, traveled south to found a new city, Dos Pilas. This was a standard bit of political expansion, establishing a new outpost to secure trade routes and project the power of the Tikal dynasty. For 2 decades, everything proceeded according to plan. Dos Pilas was a loyal client state, a southern bastion for the great jaguar city. Then, in 648 AD, the enemy made its move. The forces of Calakmul, the Serpent Kingdom, swept down into the Pitexbatun, conquered Dos Pilas and captured its king, the Tikal prince Balaj Chan Kawil. According to the normal rules of Maya warfare, he should have been taken back to Calakmul for ritual humiliation and sacrifice. But the Serpent King had a more cynical, more devastating plan. He didn't want a dead martyr. He wanted a living weapon. He turned the prince. We do not know the exact nature of the conversation that took place in the Serpent King's throne room, but the result is carved in stone for all to see. Balaj Chan Kawil was reinstalled on the throne of Dos Pilas, but he was no longer a prince of Tikal. He was a vassal, a puppet king, a traitor. His city was now a forward operating base for the Serpent Kingdom, a dagger pointed directly at the heart of his former masters, at the city of his own brother. The politics were as brutal and coercive as any in history. The order from Calakmul, while not written in these exact words, was implicitly clear, and its intent was absolute. Classified memo, reconstructed directive. Issuer, Yuknum Chin II, Divine King of the Serpent Kingdom, Calakmul. Recipient, Balaj Chan Kawil, Vassal Lord of Dos Pilas. Subject, realignment of a bloodline. Your life, once forfeit, is now ours to command. Your city, once a Tikal asset, is now the western shield of the Serpent. Your authority is restored, but your loyalty is redefined. You will make war upon your brother. You will burn Tikal's emblems and raise ours in their place. You will bleed the territory of your birth and send us its tribute. The full might of the Serpent Kingdom stands behind you, so long as you act as its fang. Falter, and your dynasty ends with you. This is not a negotiation. It is your new reality. The betrayal was immediate and absolute. Just a few years later, Balaj Chan Kawil, backed by the might of his new overlord, launched a war against Tikal. The hieroglyphic staircase at Dos Pilas records the outcome in chilling, boastful detail. He defeated the forces of his own home city. He captured a Tikal noble. The texts even claim he forced his own brother, the king of Tikal, to flee his city in humiliation. It was a geopolitical earthquake. This single act of coerced betrayal ignited a regional world war. For decades, the Pitexbatun burned. Dos Pilas, fueled by the ambition of its turncoat dynasty, became a hyper-militarized predatory state. It conquered its neighbors, Sable, Aguateca, Tamarindito, one by one, creating a short-lived mini-empire built on pure military force. The archaeology of Dos Pilas tells the same grim story. In its final years, the city center was turned into a fortress, ringed with concentric walls hastily built from the stones of dismantled temples. The population huddled in the central plaza, living in a permanent state of siege. This was not a system designed for resilience. It was a death spiral. By the middle of the 8th century, the predatory kingdom of Dos Pilas had exhausted its environment and alienated all its neighbors. The brutalized vassal states rebelled, the kingdom shattered, and the city of Dos Pilas was violently overthrown and abandoned. It died not of thirst, but of war. And here is the crucial fact. Its collapse occurred around 761 AD, a full half-century before the peak of the megadroughts recorded in the Lake Chichancanab sediment cores. The meta-commentary from this one case file is damning. The history of Dos Pilas, painstakingly reassembled by archaeologists like Arthur Demarest, provided the first undeniable text-based proof that internal political failure and endemic warfare were not just symptoms of the collapse, they were primary causes. The story showed in horrific detail how the elite political games of divine kings could lead to total systemic failure, creating a wasteland of depopulated cities long before the worst of the climate changes kicked in. Dos Pilas wasn't an anomaly. It was the first domino, and its fall was about to show just how unstable the whole structure of the classic Maya world truly was. The Dos Pilas file was a tactical breakthrough for the insurgency against the official narrative. It proved, on a local scale, that a Maya kingdom could die of purely political causes. But the establishment, the drought hawks, could still dismiss it. They could claim it was a localized anomaly, a particularly nasty gang war in a bad neighborhood that didn't reflect the bigger picture. To truly break the back of the simple climate theory, the insurgents needed to show that this political chaos wasn't an isolated incident. They needed to zoom out and look at the timeline of the entire so-called collapse. And when they did, they found the most inconvenient truth of all. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a sudden, simultaneous event. It was a slow, agonizing, rolling blackout that took 150 years to plunge the Maya heartland into darkness. This timeline, this simple sequence of events, is perhaps the single most damning piece of evidence against a monolithic cause. The methodology for tracking this rolling failure is brutally simple. For a classic Maya king, one of the fundamental expressions of power and legitimacy was the erection of stone monuments, or stelae, stamped with a long count date. This was their way of saying, I am the divine king, I control time, and I am marking my place in the cosmic order. These dated monuments are the heartbeat of the classic Maya political system. When the heartbeat stops, the patient is dead. So, archaeologists fanned out across the ruins and recorded the last known date from each major city. What they found was not the signature of a single catastrophic event, but the pattern of a slow-moving plague. The blackout begins in the west, in the Usumacinta River Basin. Great sophisticated cities like Palenque and Yaxchilan, centers of art and dynastic ambition, go silent first. The last monument at Palenque dates to 799 AD. Bonampak, famous for its vivid murals of battle, erects its last stela in 810. The lights are out in the west before the 9th century has barely begun. Then the contagion spreads. It moves east and north into the central Petén, the traditional heartland of Maya civilization. Tikal, the ancient superpower, a city that had dominated the landscape for centuries, hangs on, but it is clearly in decline. Its last dated monument, Stela 11, is erected in 869 AD. Its mortal enemy, Calakmul, is silent by 8999. One by one, the great dynastic centers of the heartland stop recording their own history. They stop declaring their own existence. But even as the heartland is dying, pockets of vitality remain. Further south in the highlands, a city like Tonina seems almost defiant. It continues to erect monuments culminating in one dated to 909 AD, a full century after Palenque went dark. In the north, as we shall see, cities weren't just surviving, they were beginning to boom. The picture is a chaotic, staggered mess. It is a slow-motion implosion, not a sudden explosion. This complex, inconvenient reality was a direct challenge to the neatness of the climate models, a source of profound friction between the geochemists and the archaeologists working in the dirt. Uncomfortable. Quote, "You keep showing me this elegant graph with a clean pulse of drought peaking in the mid-9th century, and you tell me that's the answer. Well, I'm digging up a 150-year-long train wreck. My last radiocarbon dates at Palenque are a century older than my last dates at Tonina. The Patex Batoon region is a ghost town by 760, while Tikal is still putting up monuments almost a century later. Don't sell me your single event. This wasn't a lightning strike, it was a cancer with a dozen different timelines. That is the sound of the official narrative cracking under the weight of empirical evidence. A single cataclysmic drought simply cannot account for this staggered, rolling pattern of failure. If the rains stopped for everyone at the same time, why didn't the cities collapse at the same time? Why would Palenque fall during a period that the ice cores suggest was relatively wet, while Tikal weathered the initial droughts only to fall later? The meta-commentary here is that the asynchronous timeline forces a radical shift in the diagnosis. We are no longer looking for a single external cause of death. We are now looking at a systemic disease, a political contagion spreading from one polity to the next. This is the balkanization theory in action, which we will explore in more detail. The fall of one kingdom created a power vacuum. It unleashed waves of refugees. It disrupted critical trade routes. It created military opportunities for its rivals. The failure of Dos Pilas in the Patex Batoon didn't happen in a vacuum. It sent shockwaves through the region that weakened its neighbors, making them more vulnerable to the next political or environmental stressor. The collapse was a cascading failure. It wasn't that every city died of thirst. It's that the entire political network that held Maya civilization together frayed and then snapped, thread by thread, over the course of 5 generations. This understanding moves the investigation away from the weather report and toward the political science. It forces us to examine the very structure of classic Maya kingship and warfare, to search for the inherent flaws in the system that made it so spectacularly brittle. The search was now on for the nature of the disease itself. The diagnosis of the rolling collapse pointed to a pre-existing condition, a systemic disease. The question was, what was the nature of this pathogen? The answer, according to a growing faction of academic insurgents, was found in the one place the romantic narrative refused to look: the institution of Maya warfare. For years, the official story had downplayed the role of conflict. War, if it happened at all, was presented as a small-scale, highly ritualized affair. It was more like a violent tournament than true warfare, a gentlemanly contest where kings would capture a few rivals for a noble religious sacrifice, and then everyone would go back to charting the stars. This sanitized version of Maya conflict was essential to maintaining the image of the peaceful philosopher kings, but the evidence from the glyphs and the bones told a different, far uglier story. The disease was not an occasional fever of conflict. It was a chronic, incurable autoimmune disorder. It was the endemic war doctrine, pioneered by archaeologists and anthropologists like David Webster. This doctrine was a frontal assault on the old narrative. It argued that war was not an aberration of the classic Maya system. It was the central pillar. The institution of Kuhulajau, or divine kingship, was inextricably bound to military success. A king's primary function was not to be a high priest or a civic administrator, but to be a successful warlord. His authority, his legitimacy, his very claim to divine status, was demonstrated and renewed through successful military campaigns. The entire political and religious superstructure was built upon this foundation of organized violence. This wasn't the total war of modern states aimed at annexation and occupation. It was something more insidious, a perpetual low-intensity conflict designed to demonstrate power, humiliate rivals, and secure the two things every king needed: tribute in the form of goods and tribute in the form of human blood for the gods. The goal of a typical Maya war was not to seize and hold territory indefinitely. It was to raid an enemy city, defeat its army, capture its king and other high-ranking nobles, seize the effigy of its patron god, and then retreat. The captured nobles would be publicly tortured and sacrificed in the victor's home city, a powerful piece of political theater designed to show the gods and the king's own restless subjects that he was a man of power and divine favor. The captured god effigy was a symbol of total domination. This created an inherently unstable and volatile political landscape. There was no final peace, no lasting victory. Today's victor was tomorrow's target. Alliances were temporary and opportunistic. Betrayal was a standard tool of statecraft. It was a geopolitical game of king of the hill played with obsidian-edged clubs and sacrificial knives. The logic of this system from the inside was inescapable and absolute. Uncomfortable. Quote, "A king who does not feed the gods does not deserve to rule. His people see weakness in his empty altars, the gods see neglect in his meager offerings, and his rivals smell the blood of a wounded jaguar. A victory that yields no noble captives for the stone of sacrifice is no victory at all. Our strength is not measured in the height of our granaries, but in the terror we inspire in our neighbors and the divine favor we purchase with their blood. To be feared is to be stable. To be peaceful is to be a target." Now, imagine this political system, hardwired for conflict, confronted with a prolonged period of environmental stress, like the droughts of the 8th and 9th centuries. The result is a catastrophic feedback loop, a death spiral. As the rains fail and the crops wither, the common people suffer. They begin to question the competence of their divine king. After all, if he is truly divine, why have the gods abandoned them? The king, facing a crisis of legitimacy, has only one tool in his toolkit to prove his worth and appease the angry gods. He must go to war. He must capture a rival king and offer a high-status sacrifice to convince the heavens to send rain. The problem is that every other king in the region is in the exact same position, thinking the exact same thing. Suddenly, the ritualized seasonal warfare explodes into desperate, year-round conflict. The scale of violence escalates. Armies trample fields, burn villages, and disrupt trade. More resources are diverted from agriculture to defense, from building reservoirs to building fortifications. The very act of trying to solve the crisis through war only deepens it, destroying the food supply and killing the farmers. This is the autoimmune disease in action. The body's defense mechanism, its response to stress, begins to attack and destroy the body itself. The meta-commentary of the endemic war doctrine is that it provides a terrifyingly robust engine for the collapse. It explains the rolling, asynchronous timeline perfectly. The regions with the most intense political competition, like the Patex Batoon, were the first to burn out and collapse, consumed by their own hyperviolence. The disease then spread. As desperate refugees fled and victorious armies pressed their advantage, destabilizing neighboring kingdoms. The drought was not the killer. It was merely the stressor that triggered the fatal, pre-programmed autoimmune response of endemic war. The system wasn't killed by an outside shock. It was designed to commit suicide under pressure. A political system programmed to commit suicide under pressure does not simply wink out of existence. It shatters. The aftermath of the endemic warfare that bled the classic Maya world dry was not a silent, empty jungle. It was a chaotic, violent, and desperate landscape of political fragmentation. The official narrative, with its romantic imagery of cities mysteriously abandoned, is a deliberate misdirection. It uses the trope of vanishing to hide a much grimmer and more familiar historical process. The term for it is balkanization. The real collapse was not demographic. It was a catastrophic failure of the state, a shattering of central authority that turned unified kingdoms into a patchwork of feuding warlord territories. This is the balkanization gambit, the uncomfortable truth that the Maya didn't disappear. Their political system disintegrated. The term comes from the violent breakup of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkan Peninsula, a process that created a mosaic of small, hostile, and unstable states. The parallel to the Maya lowlands in the 9th century is terrifyingly precise. The great hegemonic powers, the superpowers of Tikal and Calakmul, had exhausted themselves in centuries of conflict. As their power waned, the vassal lords who had once paid them tribute saw an opportunity. The divine authority of the Kuhula Jau in the grand capitals was broken. The kings had failed to bring rain, they had failed to provide security, and they had failed to win the wars that guaranteed their divine mandate. The contract between ruler and ruled was void, and so the system fractured. Provincial nobles declared themselves kings. Old cities were abandoned as populations fled the collapsing centers of power. The world broke apart. This process is the direct opposite of a mysterious vanishing. It is a story of survival in a failed state. People didn't walk into the jungle and disappear. They adapted to a new, more dangerous reality. They left the magnificent, indefensible, monumental centers, the symbolic heart of the old, failed order, and moved to smaller, more defensible locations, often hilltops or islands in swamps. The archaeological record is unequivocal on this point. The terminal classic period, the era of the collapse, is marked by a sudden explosion of fortifications. Sites that had been open and ceremonial for centuries suddenly have massive walls, moats, and palisades thrown up around them. This is not the architecture of a civilization giving up. It is the architecture of fear. It is the signature of a world where every neighbor is a potential enemy. The grand political project of the classic Maya was over, and in its place was a brutal, hyper-local struggle for survival. This was a new age of warlords and refugees, a dark age where the only law was the strength of your own spear arm. Classified memo, a lord's directive to his heir, circa 850 AD. My son, burn the old scrolls. The histories of the serpent and jaguar kings are ashes, their promises poison. The divine mandate from the capital is a ghost we no longer answer to. Our world is now defined by the line of sight from this hilltop. Our authority extends only as far as our warriors can march in a single day. Trust no envoy. Respect no ancient treaty. Hoard your water, fortify your fields, and treat every delegation from a neighboring town not as diplomats, but as scouts for a raiding party. The great chain of tribute has been broken. Every link now imagines itself a crown. The world has shattered into 1,000 shards of obsidian. Our only duty is to make sure our shard is the sharpest. The devastating meta-commentary of the balkanization model is that it solves the central mystery of the collapse by declaring it was never a mystery at all. It was a political process. The people did not vanish. They were displaced. They were reorganized. They were traumatized. The demographic decline that did occur was not some inexplicable plague. It was the predictable result of endemic warfare, famine, and the diseases that thrive in such conditions. By focusing on the disappearance, the old narrative conveniently ignores the centuries of chaos and suffering that followed the fall of the great kingdoms. It swaps a complex story of political failure and human resilience for a simple, digestible ghost story. Accepting the balkanization gambit means accepting that the collapse was a transition, not an ending. It was the violent death of a specific political order, the institution of divine kingship centered in monumental cities. What replaced it was messier, smaller scale, and left a less impressive archaeological footprint, but it was not nothing. The Maya people endured. They carried on. The grand lie of the collapse is that it conflates the failure of the elite political class with the annihilation of an entire people. This reframing is essential. It moves the Maya from the category of extinct curiosities like dinosaurs into the realm of political history, alongside the Romans, the Greeks, and every other civilization that has seen its great state structures crumble, only to have its people find new ways to survive in the ruins. But this grim, complex truth was itself caught in a very modern kind of conflict. One fought not with clubs and spears, but with grant proposals and academic publications. It's a grim irony, one that history provides with unnerving frequency. The very conflicts we study, the patterns of rivalry, ambition, and resource competition that brought down ancient kingdoms, are often mirrored in the institutions that study them. The war for the truth about the Maya collapse was not just fought with data. It was and is a covert intellectual war, waged in the hallways of university departments, in the anonymous blood sport of peer review, and in the high-stakes battles for funding. The endorsed narrative of the Great Drought wasn't just scientifically convenient. It was professionally and politically expedient. To understand why that simple lie persisted for so long, you have to read the classified memos from the ivory tower. you have to understand that the production of history is not a pure science. It's a human enterprise, with all the accompanying territorialism, ego, and ambition. The academic landscape was its own version of the Maya political world, fractured into competing factions, each with its own territory, its own ideology, and its own powerful leaders. First, you had the establishment, the Droughthawks. This faction was centered in the hard sciences, geology, paleoclimatology, chemistry. Their evidence was isotope ratios, pollen counts, and sediment layers. They controlled the multi-million-dollar grants from institutions like the National Science Foundation, published in high-impact journals like Nature and Science, and held an almost unassailable position of authority. Their narrative was clean, data-driven, and had the added benefit of being a resonant cautionary tale for our own age of climate change. They were the academic equivalent of the superpower kingdom of Tikal, ancient, powerful, and deeply invested in the status quo. Challenging them were the insurgents, the epigraphy and warfare school. These were the code breakers and the dirt archaeologists, the ones who translated the bloody boasts of kings and excavated the hastily built defensive walls. Their data was messier, the interpretation of a glyph, the carbon dating of a burned palisade. They argued for a collapse driven by internal political rot and military self-destruction. They were the upstart kingdom, the dos pilas of the academic world, challenging the old hegemony with a new and violent narrative. Their fight wasn't just for the truth. It was a fight for relevance, for funding for their own excavations, and for tenure for their disciples. Then there were the neutral parties, the systems theorists, who argued that everyone was right and everyone was wrong. They proposed complex, multi-causal models where drought, war, deforestation, disease, and political failure were all interconnected variables in a dynamic feedback loop. While this was almost certainly closer to the truth, in the brutal world of academic politics, complexity is often a fatal weakness. It's hard to write a blockbuster grant proposal for a theory that says, "It's complicated." It doesn't produce a clean headline. It doesn't offer a single elegant villain. These scholars were the small, neutral city-states, trying to survive in the crossfire between the great powers. In this environment, careers are built and destroyed on the strength of a narrative. A tenured professor at a major university, having built their reputation on the drought model, has a powerful incentive to defend that model against all comers. Their graduate students, their postdocs, their entire academic lineage depend on the continued dominance of that paradigm. Challenging it is not just an intellectual disagreement, it is an act of political subversion, and it is often treated as such. Classified Memo. 2. Dr. Alistair Finch, Junior Faculty, Depter of Anthropology, from Dr. Eleanor Vance, Dept. Chair Tenure Committee Lead. Subject: Your Tenure Review Portfolio and Recent Conference Paper, Wang, November 5, 2003. Alistair, we need to discuss your presentation at the recent SAA conference. Your Endemic Warfare as Primary Driver paper was provocative. However, it seems to strategically omit any meaningful engagement with the Cariaco Basin core data, which, as you know, is the foundation of the department's multi-million-dollar NSF grant on climate culture interfaces. We all admire intellectual courage, but there is a clear distinction between being a trailblazer and being a saboteur. I would strongly advise you to center your conclusions to demonstrate a more integrated perspective before your final tenure portfolio is submitted in the spring. This is not a suggestion. Let's not allow a promising career to be derailed by a single unnecessarily aggressive publication. There it is, the veiled threat, the demand for ideological conformity, the cold calculus of money and power overriding the pursuit of truth. The meta-commentary is as clear as it is depressing. The history we are told is often the history that was best funded. The internal politics of the academy can create dogmas, stifle dissent, and slow the pace of discovery for decades. The truth doesn't always win. The best organized and most powerful faction often does. The narrative of the Maya collapse was shaped as much by these modern power dynamics as it was by the evidence from the past. And while the scholars fought their turf wars, a massive piece of evidence lay on the map, a whole region that defied everyone's simple models. While the southern kingdoms were burning themselves out and the academics were arguing over the cause of the fire, in the northern Yucatan, a new power was rising from the ashes, a power that would change the game completely. While the factions in the Ivory Tower were engaged in their own covert war, sharpening their arguments and defending their intellectual territory, a glaring anomaly sat on the map of the Yucatan Peninsula, a piece of evidence so profoundly contradictory that it threatened to render all their models obsolete. The simple theories of collapse, whether driven by drought or by endemic warfare, shared a common unspoken assumption that the crisis was a pan-Maya event, a systemic failure that affected the entire civilization. But this assumption was built on a lie of omission. Because while the great cities of the southern jungles were dying, a new and terrifying power was rising in the arid plains of the north. This is the Chichen Itza anomaly, the geopolitical shift that the simple climate narrative cannot survive. The northern Yucatan is a different world from the south. It is a flat, low-lying limestone shelf with no major rivers, a scrubby, drier landscape where the only reliable sources of fresh water are the thousands of natural sinkholes, or cenotes, that dot the terrain. By any objective measure, this region is far more water-stressed and agriculturally marginal than the supposedly lush southern heartland. According to the logic of the Great Drought Theory, this area should have been the first to collapse. It should have been a depopulated wasteland. Instead, at the precise moment the southern kingdoms were failing, from roughly 800 to 1050 AD, the city of Chichen Itza exploded. It transformed from a modest local center into a sprawling cosmopolitan metropolis, arguably the most powerful and populous city in all of Mesoamerica at its height. This wasn't just a city that was surviving. It was a city that was innovating, expanding, and projecting its power in a completely new way. The architecture of Chichen Itza is a shock to anyone familiar with the southern sites. Gone are the soaring, steep-sided pyramids of Tikal. In their place are vast colonnaded halls, massive ball courts, and strange circular temples. The art is different too. It is filled with militaristic themes, processions of warriors, eagles and jaguars devouring human hearts, and the infamous Tzompantli, a skull rack displaying the heads of sacrificial victims. There are clear, undeniable influences from the great cultures of central Mexico, likely the Toltecs, suggesting Chichen Itza was not an isolated, purely Maya kingdom, but a cosmopolitan hub, a melting pot of cultures and ideas. Its economy was fundamentally different, oriented toward the sea, controlling the lucrative coastal salt trade and the canoe-borne commerce that circled the peninsula. Herein lies the central, fatal paradox for the simple drought narrative. How could a civilization-ending megadrought supposedly so powerful that it wiped out the cities in the comparatively water-rich south have simultaneously allowed for the rise of a massive superpower in the driest, most water-vulnerable part of the Maya world? The question is unanswerable within that framework. It breaks the model. The very existence of Chichen Itza is a screaming contradiction. For decades, this contradiction was largely ignored by a field obsessed with the dramatic story of southern collapse. The North was treated as a strange epilogue, a footnote to the main event, uncomfortable. Quote, "For 50 years, our field has been defined by a Southern-centric obsession with collapse. They've built entire careers by performing autopsies on Tikal and Palenque. Meanwhile, we're sitting up here on a mountain of evidence from Chichen Itza that shows a dramatic cultural, military, and economic renaissance happening at the exact same time. It's not an epilogue to their story of failure. It's a completely different book, a story of success and adaptation that they simply refuse to open because it complicates their clean narrative. The meta-commentary of the Chichen Itza anomaly is that it forces a complete redefinition of the entire event. The term Maya collapse is revealed to be a dangerously misleading oversimplification. This was not a collapse of the Maya. It was the collapse of a specific political and economic system, that of the divine kings ruling the inland, river-based kingdoms of the southern lowlands. What happened during the Terminal Classic was not just an ending, but a profound and violent reorganization. Power, people, and wealth were shifting on a massive scale. The old world was dying, but a new one was being born. The rise of Chichen Itza suggests that the southern collapse may have even been a cause of its success. Perhaps it benefited from an influx of refugees, artisans, and merchants fleeing the chaos of the South. Perhaps it capitalized on the disruption of the old inland trade routes by pioneering new maritime ones. The fall of the South and the rise of the North are two sides of the same coin. You cannot understand one without the other. This geopolitical shift destroys any possibility of a single monolithic cause for the events of the 9th century. It points to a world in flux, a world where old powers were becoming obsolete and new, more aggressive and more economically flexible powers were taking their place. And it hints that the forces driving this change were not just local. The connections and the instabilities stretched far beyond the Maya heartland, all the way to the highlands of central Mexico, where another great power had already fallen, sending shockwaves that had been destabilizing the system for centuries. The rise of a new power like Chichen Itza and the violent reorganization of the Maya world was not just a reaction to local events. The system was not closed. The Maya kingdoms were part of a vast, interconnected network of trade and political influence that stretched across Mesoamerica. And to understand the instability that plagued them in the 8th and 9th centuries, you have to look back in time, hundreds of years before their final collapse and hundreds of miles to the west, to the high arid basin of central Mexico. For it was there that a true giant had risen and fallen, and the echo of its collapse was a low-frequency earthquake that had been shaking the foundations of the Maya world for centuries. This is the story of Teotihuacan, the fallen hegemon, the ghost that haunted the classic Maya collapse. During its peak in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, Teotihuacan was a force of nature. It was not just a city, it was a global superpower on a scale the Maya, for all their brilliance, never achieved. With a population well over 100,000, it was one of the largest cities in the world, a meticulously planned metropolis of grand avenues, colossal pyramids, and sprawling apartment compounds. Its economic influence was immense, controlling the production and trade of precious green obsidian from Pachuca. Its cultural and religious ideas radiated across Mesoamerica. But its influence on the Maya was not merely cultural or economic. It was direct, military, and political. Teotihuacan was a kingmaker and a kingdom breaker. The most dramatic evidence of this comes from Tikal. Glyphic texts there record a chilling event in January of 378 AD. An individual named Siaj Kak, or Fire is Born, arrived at Tikal. His name and titles are linked directly to Teotihuacan. On the very same day, the king of Tikal, Chaktok Ichak Yur, entered the water, the standard Maya euphemism for death. Shortly thereafter, a new king, a son of the Teotihuacan ruler, was installed on the throne of Tikal under the regency of Siaj Kak. This was not a diplomatic visit. This was a foreign-backed coup. For a time, Teotihuacan was the puppeteer, pulling the strings of even the most powerful Maya dynasties. Its presence, whether through direct intervention or the mere threat of it, acted as a structuring force, an external power that shaped the political calculus of the Maya elite. Then around 550 AD, the giant fell. The monumental core of Teotihuacan was systematically burned, its temples desecrated, its idols smashed. The reasons are still debated: internal rebellion, outside invasion, environmental decline, but the result was unequivocal. The great hegemon of Mesoamerica was gone. The shock of this event was so profound that it was remembered for centuries, a historical trauma that marked the end of an era. The memory of a world order that had suddenly vanished became part of the political consciousness of its successor states. Classified memo, excerpt from the post-hegemonic chronicle of a Maya sage. Let the young lords be taught. Once, the place of the gods stood in the west, and its shadow fell even upon us. Its merchants brought the green stone, and its warriors brought new dynasties. The world had an axis then. But the fire chanters say that in the days of the fifth sky, the place of the gods burned, and the axis of the world was broken. The great roads grew thorns, and the green stone ceased to flow. It was in the long shadow of that fall that the serpent and the jaguar first bared their fangs at one another, for the great eagle had fallen from the sky, and all the lesser beasts now saw a world ripe for the conquest. There it is, the creation of a power vacuum. The collapse of Teotihuacan did not directly cause the Maya collapse, but it created the necessary preconditions for it. It unleashed the very furies that would eventually consume the southern lowlands. The intense bipolar conflict between the two Maya superpowers Tikal and Calakmul, which defined the late Classic period and fueled the endemic warfare that bled the region dry, only truly escalated into a continent-spanning world war after Teotihuacan was no longer on the board. With the external hegemon gone, the two biggest local powers were now untethered, free to pursue a zero-sum game for total domination. The story of Dos Pilas, the traitor kingdom, was a direct consequence of this Tikal-Calakmul rivalry. That rivalry itself was a consequence of the power vacuum left by Teotihuacan. The meta-commentary is that this vastly expands the timeline of the collapse. The fatal illness of the classic Maya was contracted centuries before the patient died. The fall of Teotihuacan in the 6th century was a massive systemic shock that fundamentally and permanently destabilized the Maya political order. It made the system more brittle, more violent, and more vulnerable to any future stresses. The final collapse in the 9th century wasn't an isolated event. It was the terminal phase of a long decline, the final shuddering aftershock of a geopolitical earthquake that had happened 300 years earlier. But the Maya were not merely passive reactors to these grand geopolitical shifts. They were active agents in their own story, shaping not just their political alliances, but the very landscape they lived on, often with the same short-sighted ambition that doomed their kingdoms. The Maya kings were not just players in a grand geopolitical game. They were engineers, managers of a complex and demanding tropical environment. And like their political maneuvers, their environmental policies were a mixture of brilliance and catastrophic, short-sighted vanity. The endorsed narrative often vaguely mentions environmental stress, but it treats the Maya as passive victims. The truth is far more damning. While the Great Droughts were a natural climate cycle, the Maya elite were simultaneously running a massive, centuries-long and completely unsustainable industrial operation that amounted to environmental self-sabotage. They weren't just waiting for the disaster, they were actively helping to build it, tree by tree. They were engineering their own demise. The key to this operation, the source of this self-inflicted wound, was their aesthetic. When we see the ruins today, we see the gray-weathered limestone of the underlying structure. But in their prime, the great cities of Tikal, Copan, and Calakmul were not gray. They were gleaming white, coated in a thick, smooth layer of lime plaster, and then painted with vibrant murals of gods and kings. This brilliant finish was the symbol of their civilization's power and sophistication. It was also an ecological nightmare. To create lime plaster, you must quarry limestone and then heat it in open pits or kilns to around 800 degrees Celsius to trigger a chemical reaction. The fuel for this colossal furnace was the forest. Green, living wood was the only energy source capable of reaching the required temperatures. And the demand was insatiable. The political system of divine kingship was a competitive arms race of monumental construction. Every new king had to outdo his predecessor. He had to build new temples, expand the palace, resurface the grand plazas to announce his power and legitimize his reign. This created a constant churning cycle of construction, renovation, and expansion. And every square meter of gleaming white plaster had a staggering hidden cost in acres of cleared forest. The scale of the deforestation was almost unimaginable, a slow-motion catastrophe unfolding over centuries. Uncomfortable. Quote, "We ran the fuel consumption models, and the numbers are sickening. To produce enough lime plaster to coat a single medium-sized pyramid, you'd have to clear-cut approximately 1,000 acres of jungle and burn it for weeks. That's for one building, one time. Now multiply that by every temple, palace, and plaza in every city. Then multiply it again by the constant need to renovate and rebuild over 500 years. They weren't just building a civilization, they were systematically burning down their own life support system to make it look pretty. The vanity of it is poetic. This massive deforestation wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it triggered a cascade of devastating environmental consequences. First came soil erosion. The thin tropical soils of the Petén, once protected by the forest canopy, were now exposed to the torrential seasonal rains. Topsoil washed away from the hillsides, stripping the land of its fertility and choking the rivers and critical reservoirs with silt. The very agricultural base of the kingdoms was being washed away. But the second consequence was even more insidious. The Maya were inadvertently engineering their own, localized climate change. A vast rainforest doesn't just receive rain, it helps create it. Through a process called transpiration, trees release enormous amounts of water vapor into the atmosphere, seeding clouds and contributing to regional rainfall. As the Maya clear-cut the jungle on an industrial scale, they were shutting down this natural climate engine. Scientific models have shown that this level of deforestation could have accounted for a 5 to 15% decrease in local rainfall. Here, then, is another deadly feedback loop. A natural drying trend begins. The king, to appease the gods and demonstrate his power, commissions a massive new temple complex. This requires clearing vast new tracts of forest, which further reduces local rainfall and increases soil erosion. The diminished agricultural output and water scarcity puts more pressure on the king, who responds with the only tool he has: more building and more wars, both of which further degrade the environment. The meta-commentary is brutal and unavoidable. The Maya were not hapless victims of a climate they couldn't control. They were active participants in a complex environmental tragedy. Their political ideology, with its emphasis on monumental construction as a form of legitimacy, was fundamentally at odds with the long-term ecological stability of their environment. The great droughts of the 9th century were the knockout blow, but the civilization had already been weakened by centuries of self-inflicted body blows. The collapse wasn't a sudden accident. It was the predictable outcome of a society sacrificing its long-term sustainability for the short-term political theater of its ruling class. And the very word we use for this outcome, collapse, is itself a deception, a dramatic term that masks the true nature of this long, agonizing process. Language is a weapon. In the war for historical narrative, the side that controls the vocabulary controls the truth. And in the entire dossier of the Maya mystery, no single word has been more effective, more seductive, and more fundamentally deceptive than collapse. It is the cornerstone of the entire edifice of the endorsed narrative. It is a brilliant piece of propaganda, condensing a chaotic 150-year-long process of political transformation into a single, dramatic, and easily digestible event. The word itself is a lie. It conjures images of a building suddenly imploding, of a structure that is there one moment and gone the next, a pile of rubble. This is not what happened. The reality was a slow, agonizing, and in many ways fiercely creative period of change. To get to the truth, we have to discard the loaded term collapse and use the one the specialists use, the term that reveals the truth of the process, the terminal classic period. Framing the end as a singular collapse is a deliberate act of narrative manipulation. The terminal classic, which spans roughly 750 to 950 AD, was not an ending. It was a transition, a violent and desperate process of social and political reorganization. It was an era of failed states, but also an era of frantic political experimentation. As the old model of the Kuhul Ajau, the divine king, proved itself spectacularly incapable of dealing with the mounting crises, some Maya polities began to experiment with new forms of government. In the north, at cities like Chichen Itza, there is evidence for a system known as multipal, or joint rule. This was governance by a council of nobles, a form of distributed power designed to be more resilient and less dependent on the divine charisma of a single fallible ruler. This wasn't collapse. This was a political revolution, an attempt to build a new operating system on the smoking ruins of the old one. The collapse narrative also implies a demographic void, the vanishing we discussed earlier. The reality of the terminal classic was a massive demographic reshuffling. It was one of the great refugee crises of the ancient world. Populations fled the dying, war-torn kingdoms of the southern heartland. They migrated north to the booming cities of the Yucatan, like Chichen Itza. They moved to coastal areas where they could participate in the burgeoning sea trade. They retreated to smaller, more defensible and more sustainable communities in the hinterlands. The people did not disappear. They voted with their feet, abandoning the failed political projects of the elite class. The public-facing story of the collapse is a profoundly elitist one. It equates the abandonment of monumental palaces and temples with the end of a people. It ignores the fate of the millions of farmers, artisans, and laborers who simply tried to survive, to build new lives away from the epicenters of political failure. The continued use of the word collapse in the public sphere is not an accident. It is a conscious choice driven by the need to sell a simple, dramatic story. Complexity is the enemy of a good headline. Classified memo. 2. Curatorial team, Mesoamerica, a Lost World exhibit. From Director of Marketing and Public Engagement. Subject, final review of wall text for Gallery 4, the fall. Team, reviewing the draft text for the final gallery. I'm flagging the phrase a period of protracted southern lowland deurbanization and political decentralization. While technically accurate, this is academic jargon that will bore our visitors to tears. Our exit polling and focus group data are crystal clear. The audience responds to the mystery and the suddenness of the event. We are selling a dramatic story, not a graduate seminar. Please revert to the approved headline language, The Great Maya Collapse. It's powerful, it's definitive, and it's what the public expects. We can insert a sentence about regional transformation in the fine print for the specialists, but the banner over the door needs to scream, collapse. Let's not overthink this. There you see the machine at work. The truth is sacrificed for the sake of a better story. The meta-commentary here is that the terminal classic deception robs the Maya of their agency during their period of greatest crisis. It paints them as helpless victims who simply lay down and died when the rain stopped. It erases their resilience, their creativity, and their desperate attempts to adapt to a changing world. It ignores the political innovators who tried to craft a new kind of state. It ignores the merchants who pioneered new economic systems. It ignores the ordinary people who endured unimaginable hardship to build new communities. The word collapse is an act of historical erasure. It encourages us to stand before the ruins of Tikal and ask, where did everyone go? When we should be asking, what did the survivors do next? How did they rebuild? What can their struggle teach us? By fixating on the collapse, we are choosing to stare at the autopsy report of the dead kings, mesmerized by the cause of death. But in doing so, we ignore the gripping, complex, and far more instructive story of the survivors. And even the hard scientific evidence used to write that autopsy report, the climate data that seems so definitive, turns out to be far more ambiguous upon cross-examination. The case for the prosecution, the drought hawks, rested on the seemingly solid evidence of the Lake Chichantenab mud cores. But as we've seen, that evidence was being used to support a timeline of events it couldn't fully explain. The narrative needed a second witness, a final, irrefutable piece of hard data that would silence the opposition for good. In 2003, they got it. Scientists drilled into the seabed of the Cariaco Basin, a deep trench off the coast of Venezuela, hundreds of miles from the Maya heartland. What they pulled up was a climate record of such astonishing precision that it was hailed as the Rosetta Stone of the collapse. This new data confirmed the mega-droughts with terrifying year-by-year accuracy. It was presented as the final nail in the coffin of any competing theory. But under cross-examination, this star witness begins to look less certain, its testimony filled with inconvenient contradictions that the official story desperately tries to ignore. The Cariaco Basin is a paleoclimatologist's dream. The deep waters are anoxic, meaning they are devoid of oxygen. Without oxygen, there are no bottom-dwelling creatures to churn up the sediment. As a result, sediment settles on the seafloor in pristine, undisturbed annual layers, like tree rings. By drilling a core, scientists can retrieve a perfect year-by-year archive of environmental conditions stretching back thousands of years. The key was measuring the concentration of titanium in these layers. Titanium is a common element in the Earth's crust. During wet seasons, heavy rains wash titanium-rich soils from the land into the rivers and out to sea. The sediment layer for a wet year will be thick and have a high concentration of titanium. In a dry year, with little runoff, the layer will be thin and titanium poor. This gave the team, led by Gerald Hogg, an almost magical ability to reconstruct the rainfall of the past. The results were a bombshell. The Cariaco Basin core showed that the Terminal Classic period was punctuated by a series of intense, recurring, multi-year droughts. The data was far more detailed than anything seen before. It pinpointed 4 exceptionally severe dry spells, centered around the years 760, 810, 860, and a final brutal one around 910 AD. This was it, the smoking gun. The pattern was clear, a series of climate body blows that shattered the classic Maya world. The media and the academic establishment seized on it. The case was now closed. The science was settled. But this is where the cross-examination begins. The prosecution presents this data as a clean, definitive timeline of a murder. But what happens when you lay that timeline over the actual chaotic, rolling collapse of the kingdoms on the ground? The story immediately falls apart. Let's look at the evidence. The first major drought pulse hits around 760 AD. This coincides almost perfectly with the violent collapse and abandonment of Dos Pilas and the entire Pitex Batun region. This looks like a direct hit. Case closed? Not so fast. The second drought, a severe one around 810 AD, aligns well with the collapse of the Western kingdoms like Palenque, another seeming correlation. But Tikal, the great superpower of the central lowlands, weathered both of these droughts. It continued to function, to build, and to fight for another 2 generations, only ceasing monument construction around 870 AD after the third major drought. And what about a city like Tonina? It survived all of these events, defiantly erecting its last monument in 909 AD, right in the middle of the most intense drought of the entire period. The pattern is a mess of contradictions. Some kingdoms, already politically rotten, like Dos Pilas, were so brittle that the first climate shock was enough to shatter them. Others were resilient enough to withstand multiple shocks, and some, bafflingly, seemed to thrive during the dry periods only to collapse later. The Cariaco Basin data doesn't prove that drought caused the collapse. It proves that the Maya kingdoms had vastly different responses to the same environmental pressures. The variable wasn't the climate, it was the political and social resilience of each kingdom. The data is not a murder weapon, it's a backdrop. Uncomfortable. Quote, "Look, our team provides a high-resolution climate proxy. It's a graph of titanium concentrations versus time. We can tell you with an extremely high degree of confidence when the intertropical convergence zone shifted south and it was drier than average in that part of the world. We cannot tell you that the 8.6% dip in titanium in our core in 861 AD is the specific reason a king in a city 1,000 miles away, which we've never studied, stopped carving his name on a rock. The archaeologists are the ones drawing those bold, straight lines between our data points and their ruins. From a purely statistical standpoint, it's a much noisier, much messier correlation than they present in their press releases. The meta-commentary here is that the search for a single, elegant scientific answer led to a dangerous form of data fetishism. The clean lines on the Cariaco Basin graph were treated as a more reliable truth than the messy, contradictory evidence from the ground. In reality, the data's true value was in its complexity. It killed the idea of a single, century-long megadrought and replaced it with a more dynamic picture of recurring climate shocks. And in doing so, it inadvertently put the focus back on human agency. Why did one city fall while its neighbor survived? The answer isn't in the seabed off Venezuela. It's in the political choices, the strategic blunders, and the desperate acts of the people living through those droughts, people whose stories were just beginning to be read. The Cariaco Basin data gives us the weather report for the 9th century, but it doesn't take us inside the throne room. It doesn't show us the faces of the leaders as they watched their world unravel. To understand the human drama of the collapse, you have to leave the climate models behind and go to the Great Plaza of Tikal, the heart of what was once the most powerful kingdom in the southern lowlands. There, erected in front of the soaring Temple 1, stands a weathered, almost forlorn stone monument. It is known as Stela 11. It is dated to 869 AD. It is the last word ever spoken by the royal court of Tikal, and it is not a triumphant roar of defiance. It is a desperate whisper in the dark, the story of the last king of a dying city trying to reboot a world that had already crashed. The king depicted on this monument is Jasa Chan Kawil II. He was a man who inherited a ghost kingdom. By 869, Tikal was a shadow. Its population had been in steep decline for generations. The great trade routes it once controlled were severed. Its military might was a distant memory. The kingdom had managed to survive the droughts of 760 and 810, but it was hollowed out, a fragile shell. The outlying farmlands were being abandoned, and the jungle was beginning to creep back into the suburban causeways. This was the kingdom Jasa Chan Kawil II ruled, and he was faced with a crisis of faith, not just his own, but that of his entire people. The divine contract was broken, and he had to do something to prove that the Tikal dynasty was not obsolete. His solution was Stela 11. It was an act of profound and ultimately futile nostalgia. The monument itself is a testament to the city's decay, compared to the magnificent, deeply carved, intricate stelae of his glorious ancestors like Jasa Chan Kawil I, the man who had defeated Calakmul a century and a half earlier. Stela 11 is crude. The lines are shallow, the proportions are awkward, the hieroglyphs are clumsily executed. It is the work of a court that no longer had access to its master artisans. The guilds had dissolved. The workshops were empty. This was the best they could do. And the message it was meant to convey was one of pure, backward-looking tradition. The king is shown in the full, archaic regalia of his office, performing a ritual of scattering, an ancient rite of communing with the gods and sanctifying the world. He is desperately trying to project an image of continuity, of stability, of a king in control of the cosmos, just like his forefathers. It was a calculated act of political theater, a final, desperate bluff. Classified memo, reconstructed report to the Divine Lord, circa 868 AD. Your Majesty, the reports from the stewards are grim. The central granaries hold less than a tenth of their capacity. The waters of the southern reservoirs are foul and low. The lords of the outer territories of Ixtlu and Jimbal now style themselves as kings and no longer send tribute. In the city, the people whisper that the gods have turned their faces from the Mutal dynasty. We must counter this narrative of decay with a potent symbol of renewal. I recommend a new stela in the Great Plaza, before the tomb of your great ancestor. It must show you in the act of scattering wielding the Kawil scepter of divine power. It must be done quickly, with whichever of the stone carvers can still be found. We are no longer managing a kingdom, Divine Lord. We are managing the perception of one. We must show them that the gods still listen to Tikal. But the gods were not listening. Or if they were not answering. After the erection of Stela 11 in 869 AD, Tikal goes silent. For 1,000 years, it had been a center of power and culture, and its dynastic history, meticulously recorded in stone, stretches back for more than 600 years. And then, nothing. The monument was not a renewal. It was an epitaph. The ritual failed. The great droughts of the late 9th and early 10th centuries would still arrive. The kingdom would not recover. The last king of Tikal had placed his faith in the power of ancient ritual, and the ritual had come up empty. The city was left to the jaguars and the encroaching jungle. The meta-commentary of this one, sad monument, is profound. It humanizes the collapse, stripping it of its abstract scientific grandeur and revealing it as a story of human failure. It shows a ruling class, a whole ideology that has become bankrupt. Faced with a novel set of cascading, complex crises, environmental, political, and social, the leadership of Tikal had no new ideas. Their only response was to double down on the old ceremonies, the old traditions, the old symbols of power. But the symbols were now hollow. The performance of power was no longer enough. The collapse at its core wasn't just a failure of rainfall or crops. It was a failure of imagination. But even as the great heart of Tikal stopped beating, many smaller, more tenacious polities clung to a strange half-life in a world the official narratives had already written off as dead. The story of Tikal's last monument feels like an ending. It is clean, tragic, and definitive. The king performs his last rite. The city goes silent. The credits roll. This is the ending the official narrative wants you to accept. But the historical record is filled with inconvenient, unnerving postscripts. While the great superpowers of the classic era were being lowered into their graves, a number of other kingdoms refused to die. They continued to walk the earth, stripped of their former glory, animated by the ghost of the old system. They were still crowning kings, still waging wars, and still carving monuments long after they were supposed to be dead. This is the Zombie Kingdom Dossier, a collection of case files on the Maya undead, a chapter of history so messy and strange that the mainstream narrative pretends it doesn't exist. A zombie, by definition, is a body that has lost its soul, but continues to move. This is the perfect description for these terminal classic and post-classic polities. The soul of the classic system, the widespread belief in the unerring divine power of the Kuhula Jiao, the vast trade networks, the sophisticated artistic production, was gone. But the corpse of that system, the basic political structure of a king ruling a city-state, kept lurching forward in isolated pockets. Case file number 1. Tonina. We've met this kingdom before, the defiant survivor in the Chiapas highlands. Its final monument, dated to 909 AD, is a critical piece of evidence. This was more than a century after Palenque had fallen, and 40 years after the last gasp of Tikal. In a world of ruins, the king of Tonina was still proclaiming himself a divine ruler, still boasting of his conquests, still performing the rituals of a political system that was, for all intents and purposes, extinct everywhere else. Tonina was the last classic Maya kingdom, a lone survivor barricaded against the apocalypse, broadcasting its existence into a dead world. Case file number 2, Ceibal. The story here is even stranger. Ceibal in the Pitex Batun region had collapsed along with its master Dos Pilas in the 8th century. It was a certified corpse. Then, around 849 AD, the corpse reanimated. A new group of people, possibly Maya from the Gulf Coast with foreign influences, reoccupied the city. They began erecting stelae again, but these were bizarre. The figures depicted are stiff, with non-classic features, mustaches, and strange clothing. The glyphs are poorly executed. It's as if someone found the old instruction manual for how to be a Maya king and tried to follow it without fully understanding it. This wasn't a continuation, it was a reanimation, a strange, brief, and ultimately failed attempt to reboot a dead city. It was a true zombie kingdom. Case file. Per 3, Tayasal. This is the ultimate inconvenient truth, the zombie that survived until the modern era. On an island in Lake Petén Itzá, the Itza Maya, believed to be refugees from the collapse of Chichen Itza, established a thriving kingdom. This polity, Tayasal, maintained the core traditions of Maya religion, writing, and kingship for over 450 years after the collapse. They were a living remnant of the old world, a pocket of unconquered territory deep in the jungle. Their kingdom did not fall to drought. It did not fall to internal warfare. It fell in 1697 to the cannons and muskets of the Spanish Empire. The existence of Tayasal single-handedly proves that Maya civilization never vanished. It was conquered. These stories are not footnotes, they are fundamental contradictions to the collapse narrative. But they are often treated as such because they are messy. They ruin the clean, romantic story. Uncomfortable. Quote, "Let's be honest. The field is obsessed with the beautiful corpses of the classic period. Tikal and Palenque are archaeological supermodels. They make for great documentaries. My sites are complicated. They're reoccupied, the monuments are crude, the pottery is ugly. It's the archaeology of survivors, of squatters making do in the ruins of a grander age. It doesn't fit the lost city in the jungle narrative, so we get 1/10 of the funding and our work is dismissed as a bizarre post-classic footnote. We're essentially ghost hunters, and the big funding agencies don't want to pay for a ghost hunt." The meta-commentary is that by sidelining these tenacious, messy, and resilient survivor states, we are participating in the final act of their destruction. The official narrative kills them a second time. It creates a false gap in the historical record, a 500-year silence between the collapse and the Spanish conquest, making it seem as if the conquistadors arrived to find an empty land. This is a profound falsehood. They arrived to find a world populated by the descendants of the classic Maya, a world of warring, trading, and politically complex kingdoms. The Zombie Kingdom dossier proves there was no ending, only a long, difficult, and violent transformation. And the reason this more complex truth is so often ignored has everything to do with how history is packaged and sold to us, the public. The reason the zombie kingdoms are left to rot in the footnotes of history, the reason the complex truth of a political transformation is replaced by the simple lie of a vanishing has little to do with the evidence itself. It has everything to do with the vast, powerful, and immensely profitable industry of public history. The story of the Maya that you know, the one lodged in the collective consciousness, was not crafted by archaeologists arguing over potsherds. It was engineered in the editing bays of documentary production houses and in the marketing departments of our most prestigious museums. This is the museum exhibit conspiracy, a quiet, systemic, and market-driven agreement to perpetuate the simple story, because the complex truth is a much harder product to sell. It's not a conspiracy of men in a smoke-filled room. It's a conspiracy of formula. Think of every television documentary you've ever seen about the Maya. The blueprint is always the same. It opens with a helicopter shot, skimming over the green canopy of the jungle at dawn. A lone pyramid pierces the mist. The music is ominous, swelling with a sense of ancient mystery. A deep-voiced narrator intones the central, loaded question. How could a civilization of millions, masters of astronomy and mathematics, vanish without a trace? The hook is set. From there, the formula is rigid. We get a montage of their greatest hits, the intricate calendar, the sophisticated writing, the magnificent temples. The Maya are presented as peaceful, mystical stargazers. Then comes the turn. The villain is introduced, a catastrophic, unprecedented climate event. We see CGI animations of cracked earth and withered cornstalks. We meet the heroic scientists drilling mud cores from a lake, the detectives of the deep past. The climax is the reveal of the gypsum spike or the titanium pore layers. The mystery is solved. The Maya were the helpless victims of a vengeful climate. The film ends as it began, with a somber, lingering shot of the silent ruins, now serving as a heavy-handed allegory for our own climate anxieties. This formula is not an accident. It is a product, refined over decades to maximize viewership and emotional impact. It works because it is a simple, powerful, and deeply satisfying tragedy. It has a noble victim, a clear and impersonal villain, and a haunting, mysterious ending. Now try to pitch the alternative, the true story. A documentary about the long-term geopolitical destabilization of the southern Maya lowlands, following the collapse of Teotihuacan, exacerbated by an endemic political structure based on elite warfare, which entered a catastrophic feedback loop when confronted with cyclical climate change, leading to a rolling 150-year-long process of balkanization and demographic reorganization. That story doesn't get a green light. It's complicated, it's morally ambiguous, and it lacks a single clean villain. It's history, not a mystery, and the market always prefers mystery. Classified memo. 2. Senior producer, Factual Programming Division. From Head of Network Strategy. Subject: Notes on the Maya Apocalypse pitch. Samantha, I've reviewed the pitch. The visuals are stunning, but the narrative is getting bogged down in academic debates. A few key directives to ensure this hits our target demographic. Streamline the narrative. The core story is simple: brilliant mystics versus super drought. Let's not complicate it. De-emphasize the constant warfare. It makes the Maya unsympathetic and muddies the victim narrative. No balkanization. The term is a non-starter. It sounds like a political science lecture. The audience needs to feel like they are solving a single great mystery, not analyzing a failed state. The environmental angle is key. This is our modern hook. Frame them as a society that lived in harmony with nature and was then wiped out by a climate shift beyond their control. It's a clean, powerful allegory. Mystery over history. This is our network mantra. Focus on the unexplained, the suddenness, the vanishing. We are selling a question, not a complicated answer. And for God's sake, make sure you get that iconic shot of the main pyramid slowly emerging from the morning mist. It's our money shot. This same logic applies to the great museum exhibits. We are guided through galleries of stunning classic period artifacts, jade masks, painted vases, carved lintels. And then we arrive at the final room, the one that deals with the end. Dominating the space is a massive wall text with the headline, "The Great Maya Collapse." Beside it, a beautifully backlit graph of the Cariaco Basin climate data. The message is clear, simple, and scientifically validated. The messy story of the terminal classic, the political experiments, the zombie kingdoms, if mentioned at all, they are confined to a small, text-heavy panel in a poorly lit corner that 99% of visitors will walk right past. The devastating meta-commentary is that this infotainment machine creates an almost impenetrable wall of public perception. The simplified, marketable lie becomes common knowledge, so ingrained that it feels like objective fact. This makes the public actively resistant to the more complex, nuanced work of actual scholarship. The conspiracy isn't that they are hiding the truth, it's that they have successfully created a more entertaining version of it. And this wasn't the first time the Maya world had faced a systemic shock. Centuries earlier, their civilization had experienced a dress rehearsal for the final cataclysm, a traumatic episode that the system survived, but never truly forgot. The story packaged for public consumption is one of a singular, unprecedented catastrophe. A brilliant civilization, stable for a millennium, is suddenly and inexplicably struck down. This narrative of a unique failure is essential for the mystery. But it's another lie of omission. The classic Maya system had crashed before. The 9th century collapse was not the first time the lights went out in the southern lowlands. There was a precedent, a dress rehearsal for the final cataclysm that occurred 3 centuries earlier. It's known as the Maya hiatus, a traumatic, generation-long shock to the system that the civilization survived, but from which it never fully recovered. It is the system's repressed memory, a prior trauma that holds the key to understanding its final, fatal breakdown. The hiatus is a period of profound silence in the historical record, centered in the mid to late 6th century AD. Across the central Peten, and especially at the great superpower of Tikal, the dynastic tradition of erecting dated monuments, the very heartbeat of the classic political system, comes to an almost complete stop. For roughly 60 years, from about 534 to 593 AD, Tikal, the vibrant heart of the Maya world, goes dark. No new stelae are raised. No new temples are dedicated. The official voice of the kingdom is mute. For decades, archaeologists were baffled by this gap, this sudden void in the otherwise continuous record of kingly boasts. Was it a clerical error? A change in fashion? The truth, pieced together from climate data and the inscriptions of Tikal's enemies, is far more dramatic. The hiatus was the result of a perfect storm. The first blow was environmental. Global climate records from ice cores and tree rings show a catastrophic event in 535–536 AD, likely a massive volcanic eruption somewhere in the tropics, that blanketed the atmosphere with sulfate aerosols. This triggered a volcanic winter, years of cold, gloomy summers, widespread crop failure, and famine across the globe. The Maya, dependent on the consistency of their rainy season, would have been hit hard by this sudden, violent climate shock. But this environmental crisis coincided with a political one. This was the moment that Tikal's great rival, the Serpent Kingdom of Calakmul, chose to strike. In 562 AD, the forces of Calakmul defeated the army of Tikal, captured its king, Wakchan Kawil, and sacrificed him. Tikal was not just starved, it was decapitated. This 1-2 punch of environmental catastrophe and humiliating military defeat was enough to shatter the kingdom's ideological foundations. The divine king was dead, the gods had turned away, and the system broke. The memory of this earlier dark age, this time when the world seemed to stop, was seared into the consciousness of the Maya elite. It was a ghost at the feast of late classic prosperity, a warning of the system's inherent fragility. Uncomfortable quote from a reconstructed late classic dynastic history. Let the young lords who walk these plazas not grow arrogant in the sun of our new Baktun. Let them remember the dark time in the 9th cycle, when the stones fell silent for the lifetime of a man. The gods turned their faces away, the axis of the world at Tikal was broken, and the serpent of Kayan first grew bold in the shadows. We rebuilt, yes. Our grandfathers raised new temples. But the memory of that silence is a crack in the foundation of this world. What has happened once can and will happen again if the kings are not vigilant. And this is the critical point. The Maya world did recover. The hiatus ended. Tikal eventually re-emerged, crowning a new king and beginning a slow, arduous climb back to power. But the world it re-emerged into was fundamentally changed. Calakmul and its network of allies now dominated the political landscape. The bipolar struggle between the two superpowers, which would fuel the endemic warfare of the next 2 centuries, was now locked in place. The recovery, and a bitter irony, set the stage for the final collapse. The meta-commentary of the hiatus is that it demolishes the idea of the classic Maya as a stable, unchanging entity that was struck by a single bolt from the blue disaster. It reveals the system to be inherently unstable, vulnerable to the same combination of pressures, climate shock and political failure, that would later kill it for good. The final collapse was not a new disease, it was a relapse. In fact, the entire late classic period, with its escalating warfare, its competitive frenzy of temple construction, and its increasingly grandiose royal titles, can be read as a desperate, collective attempt to overcompensate for the trauma of the hiatus. The kings of Tikal and their rivals were trying to build a system that was bigger, stronger, and more ideologically potent, a system that could never fail again. But in doing so, they created a political machine that was even more resource-intensive and even more brittle. The hiatus was the system's first, non-fatal heart attack. The late classic was the frantic, high-stress lifestyle that ensured the second one would be terminal. But a new generation of scholars is now questioning this entire diagnosis, suggesting we've been reading the patient's chart all wrong. They are proposing a radical idea. Maybe it wasn't a heart attack at all. The entire narrative we have been deconstructing, from the simple drought story to the complex models of endemic warfare and political failure, operates from a single shared premise: that what happened to the classic Maya in the 9th century was a catastrophe, a failure and ending. The debate has merely been about the cause of death. But what if the entire diagnosis is wrong? What if the patient never died? In the last few decades, a new and deeply heretical school of thought has emerged. A generation of researchers who have committed the ultimate academic sin. They have proposed that we throw out the word collapse entirely. They argue that the Maya did not fail, they did not vanish, and they did not collapse. Instead, they underwent a radical, violent, and ultimately successful political reorganization. This is the resilience model, a paradigm shift so profound it seeks to rewrite the entire story from an autopsy into a biography of a survivor. This is not a minor revision. It is a full frontal assault on a century of scholarship. The central argument of the resilience theorists is that the field of Maya studies has been suffering from a profound elite bias. We have been mesmerized by the spectacular failure of one very specific institution, the political system of Kuhulajau, the divine kingship of the southern lowlands. Because this institution, with its grand temples, its beautiful art, and its written history disappeared, we have declared the entire civilization dead. The resilience model argues this is like studying the fall of the Romanov dynasty in 1917 and concluding that Russian civilization itself ceased to exist. The end of a regime is not the end of a people. In fact, for the vast majority of the population, the collapse of the top-heavy, resource-hungry, and oppressive system of divine kingship may not have been a tragedy at all. It may have been a liberation. From this perspective, everything we have previously framed as a symptom of decay becomes a sign of adaptation. The abandonment of the great southern cities was not a sign of disappearance. It was a rational choice by a populace to leave failing states that could no longer guarantee security or sustenance. The demographic shift to the north and to coastal areas was not a refugee crisis. It was a strategic migration toward new economic opportunities in the burgeoning maritime trade networks. The decline in the production of monumental art and architecture was not a loss of skill. It was a rejection of the wasteful, elite-driven ideology that had demanded such projects. The so-called collapse was the shedding of a political skin that had grown too tight and too toxic. This is a revolutionary reframing of the entire event. It demands that we look at the evidence with new eyes. The chaos and violence of the terminal classic were not death throes, they were birth pangs. Classified memo, an excerpt from a fictional manifesto for a new Mayanism. For a century, our field has been a morbid branch of forensic pathology, obsessed with performing an autopsy on a patient who is not in fact dead. We have mistaken the decay of a single political institution, the divine kingship of the southern Peten, for the death of a people and the end of a culture. This volume, and the school of thought it represents, proceeds from a new, heretical premise. There was no collapse. There was a violent, chaotic, and ultimately successful reorganization of Maya society into a more decentralized, varied, and sustainable form. We must stop studying the ending of the classic period and start studying the beginning of the post-classic. We are not forensic examiners of a failure. We are biographers of a revolution. The power of this model is that it elegantly accounts for all the inconvenient data that troubles the simpler collapse narratives. The rise of Chichen Itza is no longer an anomaly. It is the archetype of the new, more flexible, and commercially oriented political model that replaced the old one. The zombie kingdoms are no longer aberrations. They are the diverse and resilient successor states, the proof of political continuity. The balkanization of the South is not a sign of failure. It is the very process of decentralization that this model describes. The meta-commentary of this paradigm shift is the most profound of all. It transforms the moral of the Maya story. It is no longer a simple, tragic, cautionary tale about a mystical people who flew too close to the sun or were smitten by the gods of climate change. It becomes a much more complex and ultimately more hopeful story about resilience. It is a story about a people who survived a catastrophic failure of their ruling class, who endured a century of warfare and upheaval, and who managed to forge a new and more sustainable society out of the wreckage of the old. It connects the deep past to the present, framing the millions of Maya people who live today, not as the diminished remnants of a lost civilization, but as the direct inheritors of a 200-year-long legacy of adaptation and survival. To see this theory in action, we need only look at the file of a kingdom that didn't just endure the chaos of the terminal classic, but weaponized it. If the resilience model is a valid lens for viewing the past, then we should be able to find a case study. A kingdom that didn't just survive the chaos of the terminal classic, but actively profited from it. The file exists. The kingdom is Karakol, located deep in the Vaca Plateau of modern Belize. The story of Karakol is not one of tragic decline or mysterious disappearance. It is a brutal Machiavellian success story. It is the story of a regional power that weaponized the instability of the era, transforming itself into a predatory military superpower that grew fat and powerful while its rivals starved and withered. Karakol is the ultimate anomaly, the kingdom that thrived on collapse, and its existence is perhaps the strongest evidence that the entire period was not an ending, but a violent rebalancing of power. In its early history, Karakol was a bit player, a second-tier kingdom living in the shadow of the great hegemon Tikal. It was even defeated and subjugated by Tikal in 556 AD, but this humiliation was the seed of a long-burning ambition. Karakol switched its allegiance to Tikal's great enemy, Kalak Mul, and just 6 years later, in 562 AD, its warriors were part of the coalition that defeated Tikal, captured its king, and initiated the 130-year-long hiatus. This victory was the beginning of Karakol's ascendancy. While Tikal languished, Karakol began to grow, building a power base and waiting for its moment. That moment came during the Terminal Classic, the very period of supposed universal collapse. As the old world of the Peten kingdoms began to crumble, Karakol did not share in the decay. It went on the attack. The archaeological and epigraphic records from Karakol tell an astonishing story of expansion and prosperity at a time of widespread failure. While other kingdoms were ceasing monument construction, Karakol's kings were erecting stone altars boasting of their military victories. The inscriptions are filled with accounts of war against their neighbors. A famous altar depicts the captured lords of Naranjo and Ucanal, bound and awaiting their sacrifice. The kingdom became a military predator, systematically dismantling and absorbing the polities around it. And this military success fueled a population boom. At its height in the late Classic, when other cities were beginning to empty, the population of Karakol and its surrounding suburbs swelled to an estimated 140,000 people, a sprawling, low-density metropolis that dwarfed its contemporary European counterparts. To feed this massive population in a challenging upland environment, the rulers of Karakol implemented one of the most sophisticated and extensive agricultural engineering systems in the ancient Americas. They transformed the landscape, building tens of thousands of agricultural terraces that snaked across the hills for hundreds of square kilometers. This was a monumental investment in food security and sustainable land management, a proactive and pragmatic strategy that stood in stark contrast to the failing reservoir systems of the Payten kingdoms. They were not just conquering their neighbors, they were re-engineering their environment for long-term success. This was a kingdom with a plan, a ruthless and clear-eyed strategy for not only surviving the crisis but capitalizing on it. Classified Memo, a reconstructed strategic directive from a lord of Karakol, circa 800 AD, to the captains of the Sky Place Kingdom. The lords of the Central Lands grow weak. Their monuments are crude, their gods are silent, and their fields turn to dust. Listen not to their histories, but to their hunger. This is not a time for caution. It is the moment of our ascendancy, foretold at the Star War of 562. Every sign of their weakness is a divine mandate for our strength. We will not share in their decline. We will feed on it. Seize their cacao groves, capture their master scribes, and divert their trade routes through our causeways. Let their fall be the foundation of our rise. The age of the jaguar is past. The age of Karakol is now. The meta-commentary of the Karakol file is that it proves, beyond any doubt, that the Terminal Classic was a period of winners and losers. It was a zero-sum game. The collapse of one region or one kingdom could be the direct cause of the prosperity of another. Power, wealth, and people were not simply vanishing from the map. They were in flux, moving toward the centers that could offer stability and opportunity. Karakol, with its aggressive military and its resilient agricultural system, became one of those centers. Its story completely invalidates any monolithic single-cause explanation for the events of the 9th century. You cannot tell a simple story about a universal drought-induced collapse when a superpower city was simultaneously building thousands of miles of agricultural terraces to manage its booming population. The pie wasn't just shrinking, it was being violently re-sliced by the sharpest knife. Karakol proves that the story of the end of the Classic period is a story of radical, brutal reorganization. But even in this world of winners and losers, there was an invisible enemy that stalked them all. A silent killer that thrived in times of war and famine. In the grand geopolitical chess game of the Terminal Classic, we have tracked the movements of kings, the strategies of warlords, and the cold, impersonal advance of climate change. We have analyzed the system from the top down. But all states, all armies, all civilizations are built upon a biological foundation, the bodies of their people. And while the elite were carving their histories on stone, a darker, more intimate history was being carved directly into the bones of their subjects. This is the specter of pestilence, the story told by the skeletons. It is the grim, bottom-up reality of the collapse, an invisible enemy of malnutrition and disease that history books, with their preference for the grand and the glorious, conveniently forget. The field is called bioarchaeology, the forensic analysis of human remains to reconstruct the lives of people in the past. The skeletons are the ultimate silent witnesses. A stone monument can lie. It is by nature propaganda. A skeleton cannot. It is an honest biological ledger of a person's life. It records periods of starvation, the ravages of chronic illness, the trauma of violence. And when bioarchaeologists began to systematically study the remains of the Maya from the late and Terminal Classic periods, The ledger they read was horrifying. It was the story of a population in the midst of a catastrophic public health crisis. The first and most widespread piece of evidence was for chronic, systemic malnutrition. Archaeologists found this written on the bones in several ways. They found a high prevalence of parodic hyperostosis and crabro-orbitalia, technical terms for a pathological porosity that appears on the skull and in the eye sockets. These are not diseases in themselves. They are the physical symptoms of severe long-term iron deficiency anemia. They are the marks of a population that is slowly starving. On the long bones of arms and legs, they found Harris lines, small, dense lines that indicate a period when bone growth stopped due to malnutrition or severe illness during childhood. On the teeth, they found widespread evidence of linear enamel hypoplasia, defects in the enamel that serve as a permanent record of nutritional stress during the years the teeth were forming. This wasn't a case of a few unfortunate individuals. Study after study from Copan to the Pétain showed the frequency of these pathologies increasing dramatically as the classic period drew to a close. The bodies of the commoners and even many of the elite were screaming a story of endemic hunger. And a malnourished body is a weak body, a body with a compromised immune system, a body that is a perfect host for infectious disease. The evidence for this is harder to find, as most diseases leave no trace on the skeleton. But what is there is grim. Signs of treponemal infections like yaws, of tuberculosis, and of the widespread effects of parasitic infections and dysentery, diseases that thrive in conditions of contaminated water, poor sanitation, and high population density, all appear in the record. The great Maya cities, once centers of power, were becoming petri dishes. Uncomfortable. Quote, "Sure, everyone wants to hear about the kings and the calendar. No one wants me to pull up the PowerPoint and show them my slides of a 5-year-old's skull from Tikal, riddled with parodic hyperostosis. It means the child was so anemic from a poor maize-based diet that their skull literally grew spongy to produce more red blood cells. It's the physical signature of starvation. We have thousands of these cases from the terminal classic. It is the collapse, written in bone. But it's ugly, it's visceral, and it doesn't look good on a museum fundraising brochure, does it? The truth is in the teeth, not just on the thrones. Here we see another of the deadly feedback loops that characterize the end of the classic world. Drought and warfare lead to crop failure and the disruption of trade. This leads to widespread malnutrition. Malnutrition weakens the population, making them highly susceptible to epidemic disease. A sick, weakened population cannot effectively work the fields, leading to further food shortages. A sick, weakened army cannot defend the state. A sick, malnourished population has lower birth rates and higher infant mortality, leading to demographic decline. It is a biological death spiral, a cancer that rots a society from the inside out, from the bottom up. The meta-commentary of this bioarchaeological evidence is that it provides a vital, humanizing counter-narrative to the top-down histories of kings and climate. The grand strategies of the elite were being enacted by people whose bodies were breaking down. The orders were given by kings, but the work was done by a populace that was increasingly hungry and sick. The collapse wasn't just an abstract political or climatic event. It was a lived experience of profound and prolonged physical suffering. No single theory of the collapse is complete without acknowledging this fundamental biological reality. The kingdoms were not just politically bankrupt, they were biologically insolvent. In the modern era, with all of these terrifying interconnected variables now on the table, a new kind of scholar has entered the game, attempting to use the power of computing to untangle the chaos and find a final definitive answer. We have arrived at a state of almost unbearable complexity. The file on the Maya collapse is overflowing with competing motives and contradictory evidence. We have droughts, dynastic wars, endemic political failure, self-inflicted environmental ruin, population-wide health crises, and geopolitical shockwaves from distant fallen empires. Each variable is locked with every other in a series of deadly feedback loops. Faced with this tangled, chaotic system, the human mind, with its preference for linear narrative, begins to fail. And so, in the 21st century, a new kind of investigator has been brought onto the case, a final, desperate attempt to find a single, authoritative truth in the noise. This is the multi-agent model gambit, the effort to build a perfect digital replica of the Maya world, a voodoo doll of the past, and torture it with virtual disasters until it confesses the true cause of its own death. The technology is called agent-based modeling, or ABM. It is, in theory, a profoundly powerful tool. Researchers create a virtual sandbox, a digital landscape of the Maya lowlands, complete with simulated rainfall, soil fertility, and city locations. They then populate this world with thousands of autonomous digital agents. You have farmer agents, programmed with simple rules: find a good plot of land, grow maize, feed your family. You have noble and king agents, programmed with different rules: extract tribute from farmers, wage war on neighbors to gain prestige, build monuments to legitimize your rule. The researchers input the known boundary conditions, the population estimates from archaeology, the precise drought data from the Cariaco Basin, and then they hit run. For days or weeks, the computer simulates centuries of Maya history. The agents are born, they farm, they form alliances, they fight, they starve, and they die. And the researchers watch, like gods, to see if their virtual world collapses on schedule in the 9th century. This is the gambit. It's a high-tech seance, an attempt to rerun history in a machine to find the prime mover. The goal is to tweak the variables. What happens if we make the droughts 20% more severe? What happens if we make the warfare 50% more destructive? What happens if we program the elite to hoard more food during famines? The researchers run hundreds of simulations, and if they can find a combination of variables that reliably produces a virtual collapse mirroring the archaeological record, they believe they have found the answer. It is the ultimate expression of the desire for a clean, quantifiable scientific solution to a messy human problem. But there is a profound and deeply cynical flaw in this logic. The model is not an objective representation of reality. It is a complex reflection of the biases and assumptions of its creators. The results it produces are not discovered truths. They are the logical outcomes of the rules the researchers themselves wrote into the code. The process is not one of discovery. It is one of reverse engineering a conclusion that is already known. Classified memo to Maya Sim Graduate Research Team. From Dr. M. Thorne Project Lead. Subject: Q3 Model Calibration and Parameter Adjustment Team. The latest simulation runs are still not producing a sufficient depopulation event in the southern lowlands post-800 AD. The virtual population is proving too resilient. For the next iteration, we need to adjust the core parameters. Increase the elite resource hoarding variable by a minimum of 15%, and decrease the agricultural land resilience factor for all non-terraced Paten grid squares. More importantly, we need to significantly amplify the conflict drought feedback loop. If a multi-year drought is triggered in the climate module, the interpolity conflict likelihood multiplier needs to be doubled. The model must be calibrated to reflect the known archaeological outcome. Remember, we are not discovering the why from scratch. We are building a functional simulation that demonstrates the most plausible how. Read that last line again. We are not discovering. We are building a functional simulation that demonstrates. This is the entire gambit in a nutshell. It is a high-tech exercise in confirmation bias. If the model doesn't produce the collapse you expect, you don't question your theory. You recalibrate the model until it does. The meta-commentary is that this represents the final and most sophisticated attempt to create a simple answer. It cloaks the messy, subjective work of historical interpretation in the authoritative, objective language of computer code and statistics. It creates a new kind of black box, a high-tech oracle whose conclusions are almost impossible for an outsider to question. The computer simulation proves that drought combined with warfare was the cause. It sounds definitive, final, but it is merely the ghost in the machine, a reflection of the theories we fed into it in the first place. This is not to say the models are useless. They are powerful tools for visualizing the interplay of complex factors. They consistently show that no single variable can cause the collapse alone, and that the combination of climate stress and political fragmentation is particularly lethal. But they are not an answer. They are a mirror. And after running all the models, after cross-examining all the witnesses, we are left where we began with the original suspect. It is time to step back from the chaos and render a final synthesized verdict on the role of the great droughts. We have reached the end of the investigation. We have cross-examined the scientific data. We have reviewed the decoded intelligence from the stone monuments. We have analyzed the geopolitical landscape, and we have sifted through the grim evidence in the bones. All the theories, from the elegant simplicity of climate change to the chaotic complexity of the computer models, have had their say. It is time to render a final verdict on the primary suspect, the defendant that has stood at the center of this trial for over a century, the great droughts of the 9th century. And the verdict is this: the drought is guilty, but only of a lesser charge. It was an accomplice to the crime, a hired gun. The great droughts were not the cause of the classic Maya collapse. They were merely the triggerman for a political system already riddled with terminal flaws. The mastermind, the true architect of the collapse, was the institution of classic Maya divine kingship itself. The climate was the pressure that was applied, but the political system was the crack in the foundation that caused the entire structure to shatter. To convict the drought as the sole perpetrator, the prosecution would need to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and the evidence simply is not there. Let us review the file one last time. The timeline does not fit. As the cross-examination of the Cariaco Basin data showed, the pattern of collapse is a staggered, 150-year-long rolling blackout that does not perfectly align with the drought pulses. Some kingdoms, like those in the Pitex Batoon, were already burning themselves out in internecine warfare long before the most severe droughts hit. Others, like Tikal, weathered the initial climate shocks only to fall later. Still others, like Tonina, clung to life through the very worst of it. A single, omnipotent killer does not pick and choose its victims so erratically over the course of 5 generations. The geography does not fit. The drought theory cannot account for the profound regional variation. It cannot explain the Chichen Itza anomaly, the explosion of a massive, water-dependent superpower in the driest part of the Yucatan at the exact same time the wetter south was failing. It cannot explain the warlords of Caracol, a kingdom that not only survived the crisis but thrived on it, expanding its military power and building vast agricultural works while its neighbors decayed. If the drought was a universal solvent, it should have dissolved everyone. It did not. The method does not fit. The droughts attacked the agricultural and water systems, yes, but that attack was amplified and accelerated by the Maya elite's own actions. Their obsession with plastering monumental buildings led to massive deforestation, which degraded their soil and likely reduced local rainfall. Their political system, based on endemic warfare, meant their default response to any crisis was more violence, which destroyed farmland, created refugees, and shattered trade networks. The political system was an autoimmune disease. The drought was merely the stressor that triggered the fatal immune response. Uncomfortable. Quote, "For a generation, we wanted the villain to be the weather. It's clean. It's dramatic. It absolves everyone of their agency and turns history into a simple, natural tragedy. But the mountain of evidence is now undeniable. The droughts didn't kill the classic Maya civilization. The droughts held up a mirror and revealed that the civilization's political core was already dead. It was a walking corpse, an ideological zombie. The climate just gave it the final push. This is the final verdict. The drought was the triggerman who walked into a room filled with bitter rivals, all of whom had their own knives drawn and pointed at each other. The drought certainly made a bad situation catastrophically worse. They were the catalyst that accelerated a chemical reaction that was already underway. They were the stress test that the brittle political structure of divine kingship was guaranteed to fail. The final crucial meta-commentary is this: the story of the Maya collapse is not, at its heart, an environmental story. It is a political story. It is a timeless and terrifying lesson in how a society's internal structure, its political ideologies, and the choices of its elite determine its capacity to survive an external crisis. A resilient, flexible, and cooperative society might have weathered the climate shocks of the 9th century. The classic Maya world, built on a foundation of divine autocrats, ritualized violence, and conspicuous consumption, was none of those things. It was a system designed for prosperity, not for crisis. The droughts did not cause the collapse. The droughts revealed the collapse that was already happening from within, and the persistent simplistic lie that it was all just the weather has had a long, dark and damaging shadow, a legacy that affects millions of people to this day. The story of the Maya collapse, as it is told in museums and on television, is a ghost story. It's a clean, romantic tragedy about a lost world. But the lie of the vanished Maya has a shadow, and in that shadow, real people live. The simplistic narrative of a great civilization that disappeared is not just a harmless historical error. It is a political tool. It is an intellectual justification for centuries of marginalization, dispossession, and violence against the millions of Maya people who had the profound audacity not to vanish. The long shadow of this lie is not cast over the ancient past. It is cast over the present day, and its consequences are measured in stolen land, suppressed culture, and human lives. This is how the weapon works. If you define a civilization exclusively by its most spectacular achievements, the monumental temples, the divine kings, the intricate writing, and then you declare that civilization collapsed, you have performed a powerful act of historical severance. You have snapped the link between the glorious past and the inconvenient present. The people who live today, the 6 million speakers of Mayan languages who inhabit the same lands as their ancestors, can now be framed as something other, something lesser. They are not the inheritors of that great legacy. They are merely squatters in its ruins. They are the disconnected, degraded remnants, not the resilient survivors. Once you have established this premise, you can justify almost anything. Consider the issue of land rights. Across Central America, modern Maya communities find themselves in a constant struggle to protect their ancestral lands from governments and corporations who want them for logging, for oil drilling, for cattle ranching, or for massive, foreign-owned tourist resorts. The collapse narrative becomes a key legal and rhetorical weapon for the developers. The argument is as simple as it is brutal. The great civilization that built these cities vanished 1,000 years ago. The land was abandoned. It is now state property. The claims of the modern Maya are therefore illegitimate. The lie becomes a bulldozer. Classified memo, internal legal strategy, unnamed agro-industrial corporation circa 1990s. Subject: overcoming indigenous land claims in the Petén Basin. Regarding the ongoing indigenous protests against our land grant, our legal position must be firm. The protesters' claims of continuous ancestral ownership of the lands surrounding the classic-era sites are historically and legally tenuous. The overwhelming weight of popular and scholarly literature describes a definitive societal collapse and total abandonment of these specific territories by the 10th century AD. The groups we are engaging with are a post-conquest ethno-linguistic population whose direct, unbroken lineage to the builders of the monuments cannot be definitively proven. Therefore, our argument is that we are not dispossessing the original owners. The original owners vanished from history. The land reverted to a state of nature and is now under the legal stewardship of the nation-state, which has lawfully granted it to us. We must frame this as a legal issue of modern land tenure, not a historical issue of ancient inheritance. This is the cold, cynical calculus. The historical narrative is weaponized to erase a people's claim to their own home. This erasure extends to culture. The ancient Maya are celebrated in national museums, their faces are printed on currency, their ruins are the crown jewels of the tourism industry. But the living Maya are often treated with contempt. Their languages are dismissed as dialects, their religious practices are suppressed, and their participation in the management of their own heritage sites is minimal. They become living props in a tourist diorama, hired to perform a traditional dance or sell woven trinkets to visitors who have just been told that the real Maya disappeared centuries ago. The most horrific consequence of this narrative was seen during the Guatemalan Civil War, when the state, in its counterinsurgency campaigns, committed acts of genocide against the Maya population. This violence was fueled by a deep-seated racist ideology that viewed the indigenous people as a backward, subhuman obstacle to the creation of a modern, non-indigenous nation. The idea that their great ancestors had vanished long ago made it easier to justify vanishing them in the present. The final devastating meta-commentary is this: the story we tell about the Maya collapse is not an abstract academic debate. It has power. The narrative of a mysterious, sudden vanishing is an act of continued intellectual colonialism. It perpetuates a myth that serves the powerful at the expense of the powerless. It allows the world to profit from the spectacle of Maya ruins while ignoring the struggles of Maya people. To challenge this lie, to replace the story of collapse with one of resilience, transformation, and survival, is not just about correcting the historical record. It is an act of justice. It is an acknowledgement that the Maya did not vanish. They are still here, and the entire century-long search for a single simple cause for their ancestors' crisis may reveal more about us and our own need for simple answers than it does about them. So where does this leave us? We have traveled from the silent, vine-choked ruins of the 19th century to the sterile, clean rooms of modern geochemistry. We have listened to the whispers from the lake beds and the shouts from the palace walls. We have tracked the movements of armies, the ravages of disease, and the long, cold shadow of a fallen superpower. We have run the computer simulations. And after all of this, after peeling back every layer of this vast and complex historical event, we are left with the final, most uncomfortable truth of all. The search for a single cause for the Maya collapse was always a fool's errand. The question itself was the original sin. The entire century-long investigation, with its warring academic factions and its competing silver bullet theories, reveals far more about our own deep-seated, desperate need for simple answers than it does about the Maya themselves. History is not a detective novel. There is no single culprit, no convenient smoking gun waiting to be found in the final chapter. Complex societies are complex systems, and complex systems do not fail for simple reasons. They fail when multiple interconnected stressors overwhelm their capacity to adapt. They die from a cascade of systemic failures, 1,000 cuts, not a single stab wound. This is the unbearable complexity of truth. It is messy, it is multi-causal, it is ambiguous, and it is profoundly unsatisfying. And we, as a species, hate it. We are narrative creatures. We crave a clear story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. We need a hero, a villain, and a simple moral. The simple drought narrative gave us all of that. The Maya were the noble, tragic heroes. The climate was the implacable villain. The moral was a clean and timely cautionary tale about environmentalism. It was a perfect story. And for that reason, it was aggressively and at times dishonestly defended against the messy onslaught of contradictory evidence. The evidence of endemic warfare was a complication. The evidence of a rolling, asynchronous collapse was an inconvenience. The evidence of political resilience and reorganization in the North was a paradox that had to be ignored. The evidence of the living, breathing descendants was an inconvenient postscript to a story that was supposed to be over. The real mystery is not what happened to the Maya. The real mystery is why we, for so long, have been so profoundly determined to misunderstand them. The answer, perhaps, is a form of societal vanity. We look back at the ruins of this great civilization, and we see a mirror. We are terrified by their failure because it reminds us of our own fragility. And so, we project our own anxieties and our own hopes onto their story. We search for a simple, manageable cause for their collapse, a great drought, a foolish king, because if we can identify a single fatal error, then we can reassure ourselves that we can avoid it. If they failed because of climate change, then the answer is for us to manage our climate. If they failed because of warfare, then the answer is for us to be more peaceful. But the truth is far more terrifying. They failed because their political, economic, and environmental systems were all deeply intertwined, and a crisis in one area triggered a cascading failure in all the others. They failed because of complexity itself. The classic Maya collapse is not a cautionary tale with a simple moral. It is a Rorschach test. The drought hawks see a warning about climate. The warfare theorists see a confirmation of humanity's violent nature. The resilience theorists see a story of hope and adaptation. They are all looking at the same inkblot and seeing the shape of their own convictions. The truth is not in any one of these interpretations, but in the unnerving superposition of them all at once. The Maya were not the victims of a single villain. They were the authors of a brilliant and unsustainable way of life, and they were the victims of bad luck, bad timing, and their own worst instincts, all at the same time. The most honest thing we can do is to stand before the unbearable complexity of their story and admit that our desire for a simple truth is the most misleading artifact of all. What we're left with is the ghost of a world order and the resilient scattered descendants who survived its fall. The collapse of the classic Maya kings was not an ending, but a violent transformation whose consequences are still being felt. The simple truths we started with, drought, war, disappearance, all dissolved into a much messier and more uncomfortable reality of cascading failures and radical reorganization. In this series, we piece together the evidence that complicates the official story, but it is a synthesis. The memos are reconstructed, the quotes are synthesized, all to reveal the deeper paradoxes and cynical logic that drive history forward. Official narratives are never the whole story, and the quiet spaces between the facts are often where the most important truths are hiding. I encourage you to look at the sources, to read the archaeology, to question what you've been told, and to share your own research in the comments below. The dossier is never truly closed, and that's the truth they tried to bury. Until next time, always question the official story.